My mother had just looked me in the eye and said, "Paige never came here. This is your fault," when Rook tore out of the trees behind their house. Mud covered his chest. Rust streaked his working harness. He stopped at my knees, panting hard, and stared at the small zippered pouch on his side. I opened it. Inside was my mother's cracked phone. She had spent the last 20 minutes insisting she had not seen my 11-year-old daughter all evening. My father's face went gray. Rook turned toward the dark service road and barked once. I followed him before either of them could say another word. Before I tell you how we got to that moment, I hope you're doing well wherever you're listening from. Stay with me to the end, because what happened that night changed the meaning of family for me forever. And if stories like this matter to you, I'd be grateful if you subscribed and stayed with us. 90 minutes earlier, the most serious problem in my kitchen had been whether an 8-year-old retired search dog was qualified to have an opinion about screen time. Rook was sitting beside Paige's chair, with the solemn posture of an animal awaiting official instructions, except his eyes kept drifting toward the refrigerator. At 8 years old, he still looked formidable enough that delivery drivers tended to stand a little straighter when they saw him through the storm door. His muzzle had silvered, and the veterinarian had started using phrases like mild age-related hip wear, but he could still cross our backyard faster than I could whenever someone opened the cheese drawer. Paige knew this and exploited it shamelessly. She had come home from school wearing one sneaker half untied, her backpack hanging from one shoulder, and the expression of someone who believed middle school was an unfortunate institution invented specifically to inconvenience her. She dropped into a kitchen chair, looked at Rook, then at me, and announced that he agreed the family phone rules were unreasonable. Rook stared at the refrigerator. "He's supporting me," she said. I pointed out that Rook had spent years learning search discipline, and that his professional judgment was probably being compromised by the fact that she controlled the cheese drawer. Paige scratched behind his ears. That sounds like something a person losing an argument would say. The corner of my mouth betrayed me before I could stop it. That was how most of our disagreements still worked then. Paige was 11, suspended somewhere between the little girl, who still wanted me to check the closet after a nightmare, and the almost teenager, who could make one raised eyebrow feel like a congressional inquiry. She wanted independence in large dramatic portions, while still expecting me to know where her missing sweatshirt was. I had been trying not to take that contradiction personally. A song was playing from the speaker beside the sink, one I had loved in college. Paige listened for perhaps 10 seconds before declaring my playlist ancient. I told her the song wasn't even 20 years old. The look she gave me said I had just proven her case. Rook sneezed. Paige pointed at him. "See? Ordinary moments become sacred only after you know they are about to disappear." At the time, it was just another October evening in Millhaven, Pennsylvania, cool enough for the windows to be closed, but not cold enough to turn on the heat. Rain earlier in the week had left the backyard smelling of wet leaves and dark soil. The maple beyond our fence was halfway through changing, with orange clustered along one side and stubborn green hanging on the other. I remember noticing it while rinsing a glass because I was thinking I should rake that weekend. Nothing in the room warned me to memorize it. Rook's old search and rescue harness hung over the back of a chair. Even after he retired from the volunteer county SAR program, I kept parts of his routine alive. It was good for him, and maybe for me too. I had handled him through most of his working years, and letting all of those habits disappear at once had felt wrong. Paige had grown up around them. She knew the difference between his ordinary leash and the broader harness he associated with having a task. She knew not to distract him when he was scenting. She knew the little flat utility pouch on his side had once carried identification cards, gloves, or lightweight supplies during training. Most importantly, she knew the simplest return routine. Sometimes in the yard, I would walk out of sight while Paige held Rook. She would tuck one of my gloves into his pouch, wait a moment, then say, "Back." Rook would follow the route I had taken and return to me. It wasn't magic. It wasn't Lassie understanding a crisis. It was repetition, scent, familiarity, and thousands of small rewards layered over years. Paige loved performing the drill, even though Rook had been retired long enough that the reward was usually cheese instead of praise from another SAR volunteer. That afternoon, she had insisted on doing it once before dinner. Rook had trotted around the side of the house, found me beside the garage, and nudged my palm with the dignified expectation of a professional collecting his fee. By the time we went inside, Paige had left his harness on because she intended to take him out again after homework. That should have remained one more unimportant detail. Instead, I would replay it later until I could see every buckle. The first thing that felt wrong that evening had nothing to do with Rook. It was Paige. For several days she had seemed fractionally out of step with herself. Nothing dramatic enough to call a teacher about. Nothing that would make a mother say, "Something terrible has happened." She was simply quieter at strange moments and sharper at harmless ones. Twice that week she had started to tell me something and stopped. Tuesday night, while I was folding towels, she had appeared in the laundry room doorway and said, "Mom, if somebody did something really bad, but they didn't mean to." Then she had looked toward the hall, pressed her lips together, and asked whether I had washed her gray hoodie. I assumed it was school drama. At 11, something really bad could mean cheating on a spelling test or telling a friend her haircut looked weird. The following afternoon, she had climbed into the car after school and asked if adults ever got scared enough to make a stupid decision. I had started answering, but she saw two classmates crossing the parking lot, waved at them, and changed the subject before I finished. I noticed. I simply interpreted what I saw through the ordinary life I believed we were living. That is one of the cruelest things hindsight does. It convinces you every warning was obvious, because you finally know what it was warning you about. At the time, I thought Paige was entering the preteen phase people had been promising me like a weather system. She was more protective of her phone, more easily irritated. Twice I found homework half finished while she stared at nothing, pencil unmoving over the page. I asked if someone at school was bothering her. She said no. I asked if she was worried about grades. Another no. I asked if she wanted to talk without me trying to fix whatever it was. That nearly got something. Her face softened for half a second, and I saw my little girl underneath all that 11-year-old armor. Then she shook her head and told me she was fine. I believed she would come to me when she was ready. I didn't know other adults were teaching her that telling me the truth could cost someone she loved everything. The argument began over something embarrassingly small. Paige was supposed to finish a short science worksheet before using her phone. I didn't care whether the worksheet was perfect. I cared that when I asked if it was finished, she told me yes. Then I found it under her backpack with half the questions blank. I stood beside the kitchen island with the paper in one hand and her phone in the other. My irritation came less from the unfinished work than from the lie. Paige knew it too. Normally she would have groaned, surrendered the phone, and tried to negotiate her way back into my good graces before bedtime. That evening, something in her tightened instead. Her shoulders rose, her face closed. I told her the phone stayed on the kitchen counter for the rest of the night, and that she could finish the worksheet when she had cooled down. She stared at me as if I had accused her of something much larger than 6 unanswered science questions. "You never listen." The sentence landed harder than it should have. There was too much behind it. I remember setting the phone down instead of keeping it in my hand. I remember lowering my voice because hers had risen, and I had learned years earlier that volume rarely improved anything between two people who loved each other. I told her I was listening. I also told her that being upset did not make lying acceptable. Paige looked toward the hallway. For one strange moment, I thought she might finally tell me whatever had been sitting behind her eyes all week. Her mouth opened. Then she shook her head. Forget it. She grabbed her sweatshirt from the chair. I knew where she was going before she reached the front door. My parents lived less than half a mile away. For years, their house had functioned as neutral territory whenever Paige and I needed space from each other. Not often, maybe once every few months. She would walk the familiar neighborhood route, cool down over cocoa with my mother or tinker with something in my father's garage, and I would collect her later when neither of us felt the need to win anymore. I had never loved the habit, but I had accepted it because I believed I knew where my daughter was. More importantly, I believed she was safe. I told Paige she could go cool off, but she needed to stay at Grandma and Grandpa's until I came for her. She gave me the stiff little nod of an offended 11-year-old and walked out. The door closed harder than necessary. Not slammed. Just enough to tell me she wanted me to hear it. For about 30 seconds, I considered following her. Then I stopped myself. I had spent enough years undoing parts of my own childhood to know that not every conflict required immediate pursuit. Sometimes space was a kindness. Sometimes a child needed 10 minutes to decide she still loved you without you standing in the doorway demanding confirmation. Paige had walked that route dozens of times. It was roughly 7 or 8 minutes if she wasn't dragging her feet. Residential streets, familiar sidewalks, houses where people knew her name. My parents were expecting no visitors, and they adored her. At least, that was what I believed. Rook stood at the front window after Paige left, ears forward. "Give her a minute," I told him. He looked at me, then at the door, then back at me. I went upstairs to put away laundry. A few minutes later, I heard the soft click of the dog flap off the mudroom, and Rook's nails cross the back step. I looked through the upstairs window in time to see him moving along the side fence. His old working harness was still on. For 1 second I nearly called him back. Then I smiled. Rook followed Paige everywhere when he was allowed to. He had done it since she was small enough to sleep with one fist buried in the fur behind his shoulder. My father even kept an old fleece dog bed near their mudroom, because Rook frequently arrived 5 minutes after Paige did, as if his job description included making sure she had reached the correct grandparents. Seeing him go after her reassured me. That detail would hurt later too. The safest place I knew had just gained the safest animal I knew. What exactly was I supposed to fear? My parents had not been perfect parents. That is the gentlest way I know to say it. My older sister, Vanessa, had always occupied a slightly different position in our family than I did. When Vanessa made mistakes, my parents searched for context. When I made mistakes, they searched for lessons. Vanessa was 3 years older and had always been good at looking overwhelmed at exactly the right moment. A missed curfew became stress. A bad decision became somebody else influencing her. A broken promise became a misunderstanding. If I objected, my mother usually told me I was too sensitive. My father preferred a shorter version. "Let it go. She's your sister." By adulthood, I had stopped expecting that equation to change. I simply built my life far enough outside it that I did not have to solve it every day. Then Paige was born. And somehow my parents were different with her. My mother remembered what snacks she liked. My father learned enough about whatever hobby Paige had discovered that month to ask real questions, instead of pretending interest. They came to school events without making them about Vanessa. They listened when Paige spoke. Walter, who had once believed fear was a useful parenting tool, could spend 40 minutes helping his granddaughter fix a crooked bicycle chain without raising his voice. Diane, who had dismissed my tears as dramatics when I was young, sat on the edge of Paige's bed through the stomach flu and changed cold washcloths without complaining. For years, I took those things as evidence. Maybe age had softened them. Maybe becoming grandparents had given them enough distance to see what they had missed as parents. Maybe people really did change. There was still favoritism where Vanessa and I were concerned. I knew that, but I had separated that old wound from their relationship with Paige. They might have failed me in certain ways. I did not believe they would fail her. That was my blind spot. Not that I thought my parents were saints. I thought they had a line. I thought Paige stood safely on the other side of it. For the first half hour after she left, I kept myself busy on purpose. I finished wiping down the kitchen, put the science worksheet on the corner of the table, instead of dramatically displaying it like evidence in a trial, plugged Paige's phone into the charger. Around 6:20, I made tea and looked through the front window. The street was beginning to lose its daylight. October did that quickly in western Pennsylvania. The houses across from mine were turning into warm squares of kitchen windows against blue-gray air. Fallen leaves had gathered in dark clumps along the curb. I imagined Paige at my parents' table. My mother would have made cocoa. My father would probably be pretending not to take sides, while quietly giving Paige the impression that she had won. I felt the first sting of regret about our argument. Not because I thought I had been wrong to take the phone, because the last expression I had seen on my daughter's face was hurt. Parents can believe a boundary is necessary and still hate the moment it hurts the child they are trying to raise. A little after 6:30, I picked up my phone and texted my mother. "Is Paige calming down? Tell her I'm ready when she is." I set the phone beside my mug. No answer. That was unusual, but not alarming yet. My mother sometimes left her phone in the laundry room or carried it into the garden and forgot where she put it. My father's relationship with texting consisted mostly of typing "okay" and accidentally sending photographs of his shoes. I waited. 5 minutes, then another 5. I checked Paige's phone even though I knew she had left it in my kitchen. There were no calls I had missed, no message from my parents, nothing. The house felt different without Paige and Rook in it. Not empty exactly. Too still. I walked into the mudroom and looked at the hook where Rook's leash usually hung. The leash was there. His water bowl held half an inch of water. A single damp leaf had blown through the dog flap and stuck to the floor. I told myself to stop manufacturing danger out of silence. Paige was 4/10 of a mile away. Rook was with her. My parents were there. 3 separate facts that should have added up to safety. At 6:42, I sent my mother another message, then deleted it before pressing send. I didn't want Paige to feel chased. Instead, I put on my shoes. Enough space, enough cooling down. The worksheet could wait, the phone could wait. Whatever was underneath that strange mood she had been carrying all week could not. I decided I would walk over, bring her home, make something warm, and tell her that I had noticed she wasn't herself. Not interrogate her, not lecture, just give her another chance to talk. I remember taking her phone off the charger and putting it in my coat pocket. It felt like a small peace offering. Maybe I would give it back earlier than planned. Maybe I wouldn't. I hadn't decided. That ordinary little parental calculation followed me all the way to my parents' house. The walk took less than 10 minutes. The air had sharpened enough that I zipped my jacket halfway up. Leaves rasped across the sidewalk every time the wind moved through. I passed the corner where Paige used to stop at age 6 because she believed one particular crack in the pavement belonged to ants, and stepping on it would ruin their house. I could almost see her younger self walking beside me. By the time my parents' porch came into view, the irritation from our argument had mostly burned away. The kitchen lights were on. My father's utility cart was parked near the side of the house where he kept it, for hauling mulch, tools, and firewood around the back of their property. Everything looked normal. That was the last normal thing I remember trusting. I climbed the porch steps and knocked once before opening the storm door. My mother appeared almost immediately. Too immediately. As though she had already been standing close enough to hear my shoes on the porch. Her face did something strange when she saw me. Not fear. Not quite surprise. Preparation. "Where's Paige?" I asked. My mother blinked. Then she said, "Paige never came here." For a moment, the sentence did not enter my mind correctly. I actually looked past her, past the hallway, toward the kitchen, as though Paige might be sitting at the table rolling her eyes because Grandma had misunderstood the question. My father came in from the back side of the house. He was still wearing his work jacket. I asked again, more slowly, whether Paige was there. My mother shook her head. She said they had not seen her that evening. The front of my body went cold while the back of my neck turned hot. I told them Paige had left my house, nearly an hour earlier. She had come here. She always came here. My father's expression tightened in a way I knew from childhood. It was the face he made when he believed somebody had caused a problem by ignoring his advice. He said maybe this time Paige had gone farther because I had pushed her harder than usual. There are sentences that enter you through old doors. I was 37 years old, standing on my parents' porch, and for half a second, I was 14 again, wondering whether the reason everyone was upset might actually be me. My mother took hold of that hesitation immediately. She reminded me that Paige had been emotional lately, that 11-year-olds could be impulsive, that perhaps I should think carefully about how angry she had been when she left. My mind filled in the rest before she had to. I had taken the phone. I had confronted her about lying. I had let her walk out because I thought giving her space was healthy. If she had turned somewhere else, if she had decided not to go to my parents after all, if she was hurt, I stepped back off the porch and looked down the street. There was nobody on the sidewalk. No purple sweatshirt. No familiar shape under the streetlights. I called Paige's name once. The houses absorbed it. Then I remembered Rook. The thought came with such sudden force that I turned back toward my mother. "Where's Rook?" She looked at me blankly. I moved past her before she could answer. There was an old fleece dog bed near the mudroom door, the same bed my father had put there years earlier because Rook so often followed Paige over. It was empty. I crossed to the back door and opened it. The yard beyond my parents' house had gone dark beneath the trees. Damp leaves reflected thin pieces of porch light. I could see the edge of the shed, the vegetable beds, the beginning of the brush farther back. "Rook!" Nothing. I called again. Rook had been trained for years to return to my voice whenever circumstances allowed. Even in retirement, even asleep behind a closed door, the sound of his name from me usually brought the heavy rhythm of his paws. No paws hit the porch. No collar tags moved. No shepherd shape appeared between the trees. Behind me, my parents were saying something. I could hear their voices, but the words stopped separating themselves. Paige had left my house. Rook had followed her. My parents were telling me Paige had never arrived, and now the dog who always came back was gone too. For the first time that evening, I stopped thinking about our argument. I stopped thinking about the science worksheet. I stopped wondering whether I had been too hard on my daughter. I stared into the dark behind my parents' house and understood only one thing. Whatever had happened to Paige, Rook had gone with her, and neither of them had come home. The absence of Rook changed the shape of the problem. Until that moment, some frightened part of me had still been trying to build an ordinary explanation. Paige had taken a different street. Paige had gone to sit somewhere until she cooled down. Paige had decided to make me worry, because 11-year-olds sometimes believed 20 minutes of parental panic was a reasonable price for confiscating a phone. But Rook did not wander. Not like that. I stood at my parents' back door, staring into the dark yard, while my mother continued talking behind me. Her voice had taken on the careful steadiness she used whenever she believed someone else was becoming unreasonable. I heard phrases about Paige being upset, about children acting impulsively, about how I needed to stay calm. The words slid past me. I was counting minutes. Paige had left my house a little before 6. The walk to my parents' place took 7 or 8 minutes. Rook had gone out through my dog flap only a few minutes after her. If Paige had changed direction somewhere along the way, Rook might have followed her scent. If she had stopped, he would likely have stopped. 2 disappearances did not prove they were together, but they made coincidence harder to believe. I turned back toward my parents. My father had come closer now. Walter stood near the mudroom entrance with one hand braced against the doorframe, his work jacket still zipped almost to his throat. My mother, Diane, had folded her arms tightly across herself. I asked them exactly when they had last been outside. My father frowned as if the question annoyed him. My mother said she had been in the kitchen most of the evening. I asked whether either of them had heard the back gate. She answered too quickly. No. Then her eyes shifted toward the dark window beside me. Well, maybe. I heard something earlier. It could have been the gate. That tiny correction should not have mattered as much as it did. People misremember sounds. People revise details under stress. I knew that. But my mother was the kind of woman who could tell you which neighbor's garbage can had been left 3 feet too close to the road on collection day. She remembered when the mail came late. She remembered which cabinet I had opened when I visited 3 Sundays earlier. She once called me because Paige had left a purple hair tie beneath their couch, and Diane recognized it as one she had worn the week before. Details were my mother's favorite currency. Now she could not decide whether she had heard her own rear gate open. I crossed the kitchen and went out through the front door. The neighborhood looked exactly as it had 10 minutes earlier, which made it worse. Porch lights, damp pavement, television flicker behind curtains, a pickup truck turning at the end of the block. No emergency, no obvious disaster, just my child, not where she was supposed to be. I walked the route backward. My parents followed as far as the sidewalk before Walter called after me that running around without thinking would not help. I ignored him. The first corner came quickly. Paige would have crossed there, past the house with the white mailbox, then continued along Hawthorne Lane toward my parents' block. I called her name as I walked, once softly, then louder. Nothing answered except a dog barking from somebody's fenced yard. At the second intersection, I forced myself to stop. Think, not panic. Think. I called one neighbor who lived a few houses from the route and asked whether she had noticed Paige passing earlier. I kept my voice controlled enough that she did not immediately hear the fear in it. She went quiet for a moment, then told me she had seen a girl in a purple sweatshirt heading toward my parents' side of the neighborhood around 6. She was fairly sure it was Paige. A few minutes later, she had also noticed Rook moving in the same direction. That confirmation should have reassured me. Instead, something dropped inside my chest. Paige had gone the right way. Rook had followed. The last reliable direction for both of them pointed straight toward the people, telling me neither had arrived. I thanked the neighbor and ended the call. When I turned around, my mother was standing several yards behind me. She had put on a cardigan but not a coat. Walter stayed closer to their driveway. I told them what the neighbor had seen. Diane pressed her lips together. She said the woman must have been mistaken. I reminded her that she had just said she might have heard the rear gate. My mother's face sharpened. She explained that hearing a gate did not mean Paige had entered it. There were cats in the neighborhood. Wind. Walter had been moving things outside earlier. It could have been anything. Each explanation was possible by itself. Together they felt like watching someone patch a roof while rain was already pouring through the ceiling. My guilt did not disappear. That would have been easier. Instead, suspicion arrived and had to share space with it. Maybe I had pushed Paige too hard. Maybe she had been more upset than I understood. And maybe my parents were lying to me. All 3 thoughts existed at once, each one pulling in a different direction. Walter walked toward us with the stiff, deliberate stride he used when he thought a situation needed his authority. He said Paige was probably hiding somewhere nearby to make a point. Children learned quickly when adults rewarded dramatic behavior. If I rushed around treating her choice to disappear like a catastrophe, I would only teach her that running away gave her control. I stared at him. My daughter had been missing for close to an hour. My father wanted to discuss discipline. Years earlier, that would have worked on me. Walter could take almost any frightening situation, flatten it into a principle, and make you feel childish for caring about the actual human being standing in the middle of it. He had done it when Vanessa wrecked his car at 17. He had done it when I cried after losing a school competition. He had done it whenever emotion threatened the clean shape of whatever lesson he preferred. That evening, something about hearing the same tone while Paige was unaccounted for made it sound different. Not wise, not calm, wrong. I told him I was not discussing whether Paige needed consequences until I knew she was safe. His mouth tightened. He said that was exactly the problem. Everything became an emergency before anyone had time to think. I pulled my phone from my pocket. I am thinking. Then I called the police. There was no 24-hour waiting period. No officer told me to go home and see whether Paige wandered back by breakfast. She was 11. I did not know where she was. That was enough. I gave the dispatcher my address, my parents' address, Paige's age, height, clothes, the time she left, the route she normally walked, and the fact that her phone was still in my coat pocket because I had taken it during our argument. I explained that Rook, our retired search and rescue German shepherd, had followed her and was missing too. Saying those facts aloud changed them. Inside the family, Walter could call Paige dramatic. Diane could call me overprotective. To a stranger taking down information, Paige became what she actually was, an 11-year-old child whose location was unknown after dark. The first deputy arrived quickly because he was already nearby. Another unit was notified while he took the basic information. There was no television-style chaos. No sirens screaming into the driveway. The response was quieter than that, which somehow made it feel more serious. Flashlights came out. Descriptions were repeated. The simple route between my house and my parents' property became a search area instead of a familiar neighborhood. I stayed close enough to answer questions without turning the evening into a procedural blur. Paige had no serious medical condition. She knew the neighborhood. She had walked to her grandparents before. She was upset when she left, but had not threatened to hurt herself or anyone else. Her phone remained with me. Then the deputy asked about Rook. That was the first question that gave me something other than fear to hold. I explained his background. Rook had worked with the county volunteer search and rescue team for years, and I had been his handler. He was retired now, but the training did not simply disappear because we stopped responding to call-outs. He still tracked familiar scents. He still understood his return routines. He still treated Paige differently from almost everyone else in the world. The deputy looked toward the dark property behind my parents' house. If Rook was with Paige, he said, then the dog's route mattered. I had been thinking of Rook as another missing piece. Now I understood he might also be the only moving piece we had. I walked through my parents' yard again, this time slowly. The rain earlier in the week had left the soil soft, but the ground around the house was too disturbed to tell me anything useful. Walter walked through there. Diane did. Delivery people did. Rook had crossed that grass hundreds of times. I was not going to pretend I could read the ground like a tracking manual just because I had once handled a SAR dog. What I could read was behavior. Rook had followed Paige. He had not returned. For Rook, staying with a person he believed needed him would always outrank coming home for dinner. My parents stood beneath the porch light while one deputy checked the edge of the yard, and another spoke briefly with the neighbor who had seen Paige. Diane kept rubbing the thumb of one hand against the side of her index finger. Walter checked his watch. The first time, I barely noticed. The second time, I did. He looked toward the rear of the property, then down at his wrist. A few minutes later, he did it again. "What are you waiting for?" I asked. The question came out before I decided to say it. Walter looked at me as if I had misunderstood something simple. He said he wasn't waiting for anything. He was nervous. People checked the time when they were nervous. That was reasonable. Annoyingly reasonable. So I filed it away with the rear gate. Not evidence, not proof. Just one more detail that would not lie flat. Diane came closer and asked whether I had tried Paige's friends. I had. None had seen her. She suggested maybe Paige had cut between streets and gone farther than usual. Perhaps she had decided she was tired of always being told where she could go. The phrasing bothered me, not because it was impossible, because my mother kept supplying reasons Paige might want to disappear while offering very little urgency about the fact that she had. I watched Diane's face as a deputy asked her again whether Paige had entered the property. She denied it. Then, because the deputy mentioned the gate, Diane repeated that she might have heard something, but had not looked outside. Walter added that the back of their property connected to enough brush and old access paths that a child could wander farther than people realized. That caught my attention. What access paths? His eyes moved toward me. He said he meant nothing specific. Old lanes, utility routes, the kind of things that existed behind older properties. I knew the land behind their house had once connected to service roads farther out, but I had never cared where they led. Growing up, we had been told not to wander beyond the tree line because much of the land farther back was privately owned or neglected. The deputy noted it. Walter checked his watch again. This time I saw Diane notice him. Her eyes met his for less than a second. Then both looked away. A cold pressure started beneath my ribs. I wanted to grab my mother by the shoulders and shake the truth out of her. Instead, I asked something simpler. "Where's your phone?" Diane blinked. I had not planned the question. I only realized I had not seen the phone that was usually attached to my mother's hand like another finger. She touched the pocket of her cardigan. Empty. Then the other pocket. Her expression changed so briefly I might have missed it if I had still been searching only for fear. I must have left it inside. She turned toward the house. Walter said her name. One word. Quiet. She stopped. The deputy beside me glanced from one of them to the other. Diane recovered quickly. She said she was sure the phone was somewhere in the kitchen or bedroom. She was always misplacing it. That was almost funny enough to make me laugh. My mother did not misplace her phone. My father misplaced his glasses while they were on his face. Diane once drove back 20 minutes because she thought she had left her phone at a restaurant, only to discover it between the seat and center console. She noticed absences, especially her own. The deputy did not accuse her of anything. He merely suggested she look for it when convenient, because having everyone reachable would help. Diane went inside. Walter remained under the porch light. I could see the pulse moving along the side of his neck. He checked his watch. Again, the search around the immediate blocks expanded. I stayed near the house because officers needed me available, but every instinct in my body fought the stillness. Mothers are built for certain kinds of action. We hold cold cloths to foreheads. We drive through the night. We check closets, parking lots, emergency rooms. We do things. Standing beneath a porch light, while other people looked for my child, felt like being asked to breathe underwater. I walked to the edge of the property and called Paige again. Nothing. Then I called Rook. My voice carried through the trees. For several seconds, there was only wind moving wet leaves. Behind me, a deputy was speaking quietly into his radio. Somewhere farther down the block, a car door closed. I called Rook a second time. No answer. I closed my eyes. I pictured him following Paige out of our yard. His old harness still buckled around his chest. The flat utility pouch resting against his side. His gray muzzle lifted into the evening air. He knew this neighborhood. He knew Paige. If she was frightened, he would stay. That thought comforted me for exactly 1 second. Then it became terrifying. Because if Rook believed Paige needed him badly enough not to come home, something had happened after she left me. A deputy approached and told me they were checking a broader area. He asked whether there were places Paige liked to go when she wanted to be alone. I named the small park near our street, a friend's porch, the creek path in daylight, though I did not think she would go there after dark. My parents offered nothing. That silence became louder each minute. Diane eventually came back outside, without her phone. She said she still could not find it. Walter's jaw flexed. The deputy asked whether she remembered when she last used it. Diane said sometime that afternoon. Maybe later. She could not be sure. My mother, who could tell me exactly when a grocery coupon expired, suddenly had no memory of touching the device she checked dozens of times a day. I looked at her hands. They were trembling. I wish I could say that was when I knew. I didn't. Not yet. People shake when children are missing. People forget details. People say stupid things. People even act guilty when they are only frightened. I was trying desperately not to convict my own parents in my mind, because every alternative was unbearable. If they were lying, then Paige had reached them. If Paige had reached them, they knew more than they were saying. And if my parents knew where my daughter had gone while police were searching streets, I could not finish that thought. Walter checked his watch again. The deputy noticed this time. So did I. Then something moved beyond the edge of the porch light. At first I thought it was another officer coming through the trees. Then I heard breathing. Heavy. Fast. Familiar. I turned. Rook came out of the darkness at a run. Mud covered the lower half of his body. Wet leaves clung to the fur beneath his chest. One side of his old working harness carried a reddish-brown smear that looked like rust. His tongue hung from the side of his mouth, and his breathing was harder than it should have been after an ordinary neighborhood run. Rook. My knees almost gave. For one irrational instant, I expected Paige to appear behind him. She didn't. I ran toward him. Rook reached me and stopped so abruptly. His shoulder struck my leg. He did not jump, did not circle, did not give me the restless greeting he usually gave after being away longer than expected. He looked directly at me, then pawed once at the small utility pouch on the side of his harness. Every sound around me seemed to narrow. Years of handling him returned before conscious thought did. That pouch meant something had been carried. My fingers shook so badly I missed the zipper the first time. I caught it on the second. The pouch was heavier than it should have been. Inside was a phone. Black case. Cracked screen. Mud pressed into one corner. I knew the case before I even pulled it fully free. My mother had bought it because Paige told her the little gold pattern around the edges looked less boring than her old one. I turned toward Diane. Her face had gone completely still. "This is yours." She did not answer. That was the first thing. The second was Walter. He did not look confused. He went gray. A person seeing an impossible object should ask how it got there. A person whose missing granddaughter's dog just returned carrying his wife's phone should demand where the dog found it. Neither of my parents did. Walter looked past me toward the trees. Diane looked at the phone, as though she had been waiting for it to come back. Something inside me stopped negotiating. For more than an hour I had been asking whether my argument had driven Paige away, whether I had been too strict, whether my daughter had chosen some unfamiliar route because she wanted to punish me. Now Rook stood in front of me, covered in mud and rust, with Diane's phone in the pouch Paige knew how to use. The story my parents had given me did not bend. It broke. The deputy stepped closer, but he did not announce an arrest or turn the porch into an interrogation room. He asked only where Diane believed she had lost the phone. She opened her mouth. Nothing came out. Rook moved. He turned away from me and headed toward the rear of the property. Not running yet. A deliberate trot. I knew that gait. I had followed it through fields, woods, flooded ditches, and winter brush during his working years. It was the movement of a dog who had finished one part of a task and expected me to understand there was another. I slipped Diane's phone into my coat pocket. Walter finally spoke. He told me to wait. I did not. Rook reached the beginning of an old service lane beyond the trees, ran several yards into the darkness, then stopped. He turned around, looked directly at me, and barked once. Whatever explanation my parents were about to give could wait. My daughter could not. I followed him. Rook did not wait to see whether I understood. He moved down the old service lane behind my parents' property, with the steady, purposeful trot I remembered from his working years, stopping only when the distance between us grew too wide. Then he would turn his silvered muzzle toward me, wait until I was moving again, and continue. The deputy nearest me asked whether I was certain Rook was trying to lead us somewhere. I told him certainty was the wrong word. Rook was not thinking in sentences. He did not know what a police investigation was, and he had not returned carrying Diane's phone because he understood the rules of evidence. But I had handled him through enough searches to recognize the difference between a dog wandering home and a dog repeating a route. Rook had come back exhausted. He had delivered something through the pouch Paige knew how to use. Now he was retracing ground and checking whether I followed. That was enough for me. Answers could wait. My daughter could not. 2 deputies moved with me while another coordinated by radio behind us. Walter came after a delay, I noticed, but did not question. Diane remained closer to the house, where another responder was speaking with her about the phone and the changing timeline. I wanted to turn around. I wanted to ask why her phone had been with Rook. I wanted to put Walter against the nearest tree and demand that he tell me where Paige was. Instead, I followed my dog. That decision would matter to me later. At the time, it did not feel brave. It felt primitive. Every part of my mind had narrowed to a single command: reach Paige. The lane behind my parents' property was not a real road anymore. Years of rain and weeds had softened its edges until 2 muddy tire tracks ran through waist-high brush and fallen leaves. The beam from my flashlight bounced over old gravel, shallow ruts and branches washed down during the week's rain. Rook knew exactly where he wanted to go. He did not search side to side the way he might have if he were trying to acquire a scent. He was traveling. That distinction tightened something inside me. Walter stayed a few steps behind one of the deputies. I could hear his breathing whenever the wind dropped. For a man who had spent the last hour implying that I was turning an ordinary runaway into a crisis, he had suddenly lost interest in telling anyone to calm down. The farther we moved from his house, the more familiar his posture became. Not frightened, watchful. He looked ahead before the flashlight beams reached each bend. Once, the lane split around a collapsed drainage ditch. Rook took the right side without slowing. Walter did too. One deputy chose left for 2 steps, and my father quietly told him the right side held firmer ground after rain. The deputy glanced down, changed direction, and kept moving. I looked at Walter. He avoided my eyes. I told myself he had lived there for decades. Of course he knew the land behind his own property. Another explanation. Another small piece that could still fit into an innocent version if I forced it hard enough. We continued. At one bend, the lane passed the rear edge of a small building supply and equipment yard. A security light burned above the loading area, with a dark camera housing tucked beneath it. I barely registered either one before the trees closed around us again. The neighborhood disappeared surprisingly quickly. Within a few hundred yards, the porch lights behind us were gone. Trees closed around the lane. Wet branches caught my jacket. The smell changed from chimney smoke and cut lawns to mud, standing water and the sour mineral scent of old metal somewhere ahead. I had not walked this far behind my parents' property since I was a teenager. I remembered being told there were old industrial access roads back there, and private parcels no one maintained anymore. Walter had always been particular about where Vanessa and I were allowed to wander. I had accepted the boundaries the way children accept most adult geography. This road was allowed, that road was not. Beyond those trees belonged to people whose names did not matter. Then the lane rose slightly. Through the bare spaces between October branches, something broke the horizon. A steel curve. For a second my mind could not place it. Then my flashlight swept across the upper section of a rusting roller coaster. I stopped walking. Rook went another 10 yards before realizing I was no longer behind him. He turned. Beyond him, half hidden by woods and darkness, stood Skyland Park. I had not thought about the place in years. Skyland had closed long enough ago that Paige knew it mostly as a name adults used when giving directions. Turn near the old Skyland Road. The gas station past Skyland. That kind of thing. When I was young, it had been one of the loudest places in the county. Summer evenings had carried music and machinery over the fields. You could see the Ferris wheel from miles away when it was lit. Vanessa had once cried for half an hour because she was 2 inches too short for one of the rides, while I had spent most of my childhood visits terrified of the costumed mascot near the entrance. After ownership changed, maintenance declined, a storm damaged part of the park. Lawsuits followed other problems. Eventually the gates closed for good. The property had been fenced and posted because too many structures were deteriorating to make casual trespassing safe. Walter had always known more about places like Skyland than most people. He had spent much of his working life around industrial maintenance, equipment yards, and service infrastructure. He understood locks, access roads, utility corridors, the hidden bones behind places other people only saw from the front. But seeing Skyland directly ahead of us changed that old fact. This was no longer just land behind his house. Rook was leading us toward a condemned amusement park. I heard myself say Paige's name, not loudly, just once. The deputies stopped with me. One of them asked whether Paige had any reason to come there. No. The answer came immediately. Paige had never asked to explore Skyland. She was curious, but not reckless in that particular way. Abandoned buildings frightened her more than they fascinated her. She had laughed through haunted attractions at fairs because she knew people were operating them. Empty structures were different. More important, nothing about our argument pointed here. She had left for my parents' house. A science worksheet did not turn into an abandoned amusement park. I looked at Walter. He was staring at the rusted coaster. "What is she doing here?" My father's face hardened. He said we did not know she was there. Technically, he was right. Rook might have followed a scent that passed nearby. Paige could have crossed the property and continued elsewhere. The phone could have been I stopped myself. There were only so many impossible explanations I could build before they stopped being caution and became denial. Rook barked once, then continued. The old lane narrowed as it approached the park perimeter. Trees had grown close to the fencing, branches pushing through squares of chain link. Warning signs hung at crooked angles. One still carried enough faded red lettering to read "No trespassing" beneath the rust. Rook went directly toward a section where several trees had come down in earlier storms. He did not go to a gate. He pushed through brush until I saw what he had found. Part of the chain-link fence had buckled inward beneath the weight of an old fallen limb. Near the ground, the metal had pulled away from one post, leaving a narrow triangular gap between twisted wire and wet soil. Big enough for Rook. Not safely big enough for us. Before anyone could stop him, he lowered his body and slipped through. His harness scraped metal. Then he was inside Skyland. He turned and looked back at me through the fence. I grabbed the chain link. Twisted wire rose on both sides of the gap like broken hooks. I could probably have forced myself through if I stopped caring what it did to my skin or clothes. I started to crouch. A deputy caught my arm. He did not need to say much. The section above the gap leaned badly. One wrong pull could bring more fencing, or the dead branch down. I knew that. Knowing did nothing to the part of me, watching Rook stand 10 feet away while Paige could be somewhere beyond him. I called her name. The abandoned park swallowed it. Rook moved a few yards deeper, then stopped. He looked back again. The deputy radioed the position and asked about getting an entry team through a secure access point. Another responder was already moving parallel to the perimeter, looking for a gate that could be opened without forcing people through collapsed fencing. Seconds felt obscene. I paced beside the chain link, tracking Rook's shape through the brush. He had found his way into Skyland. That explained one question I had not yet known enough to ask. If Rook had followed Paige here earlier, Walter and Diane would not necessarily have seen him enter. A dog trained to follow scent did not need an open employee gate if a storm had already made him a hole. But the explanation created a much worse question. How had Paige gotten inside? She could not fit where Rook just had. I turned to Walter. He had moved closer to the fence. His attention was not on Rook. It was on the dark outline of the park beyond him. The responder near us said they could cut a section of fencing, but with the tension from the fallen tree and the damaged post, it might be faster and safer to locate a proper vehicle access. Another voice over the radio mentioned checking the perimeter. Walter exhaled sharply. Then his need to control the situation finally defeated his ability to protect his own story. "The East employee gate will be chained," he said. "Don't waste time there. Take the maintenance road behind the carousel." Silence followed. Not dramatic silence. No one gasped, no music changed. But every person near that fence stopped moving in exactly the same way. The deputy beside me slowly turned toward Walter. I stared at my father. No one had mentioned an East employee gate. No one had mentioned a carousel. No one had mentioned a maintenance road. Walter realized it almost as soon as the sentence left him. His mouth remained slightly open, as though there might be a second set of words somewhere behind the first that could pull them back. There wasn't. I asked one question. "How do you know that?" His face changed. For years, Walter had been able to answer almost anything if given 3 seconds to turn it into a principle. He could explain why somebody else remembered something incorrectly, why a choice that benefited Vanessa had actually been best for everyone, why an unfair outcome was simply practical. This time, he had nothing ready. He said he knew the property. That was all. One deputy asked how. Walter muttered something about old maintenance work and being familiar with the service layout. I heard the words. I did not stop for them. Paige was somewhere inside. If Walter knew how to get rescuers there faster, then his explanation could wait until after my daughter was standing under a light where I could see her. I pointed down the fence line. "Use the road," he said. The deputy nodded immediately and relayed the directions. Walter began saying something about not knowing whether the route was still passable. I looked at him. "Then you can tell them what you know while we move." My voice sounded unlike mine. Flat. Almost calm. I did not feel calm. I felt as though some enormous force had torn open the ground beneath my family, and I was standing on one thin piece that still held. But anger required time. Accusations required attention. Paige needed both of those things more than Walter did. We moved. Rook paralleled us from inside the fence as long as he could, disappearing behind brush and reappearing between ride structures. Every time I lost sight of him, my heartbeat changed. Every time he appeared again, it corrected itself slightly. We reached an old access road where the perimeter bent away from the woods. Walter's directions were accurate. Too accurate. A service route ran behind the remains of what had once been the carousel pavilion. The carousel itself was mostly hidden behind warped wooden panels and torn sections of decorative facade. But I could still make out the peaked roof. Wind moved through the park. Something metal knocked at irregular intervals. Clang. Pause. Clang. An old chain against a railing, maybe. Farther in, loose sheet metal shivered somewhere overhead. Nothing about Skyland felt supernatural. It felt physical and neglected, a place built for thousands of feet and constant inspections that had spent years absorbing rain, freeze-thaw cycles, and wind without anyone caring whether the next board held. The entrance team came through a maintenance access point responders could use without trusting the damaged fence. I was allowed to move with them, only where the route had been checked, and I obeyed even when every instinct wanted me to rush. My years handling searches had taught me why. Wet boards, corroded railings, and weakened floors did not become safer because my daughter might be on the other side. So, I watched my footing, listened, and called Paige whenever responders said it was safe. Rook moved ahead, while flashlight beams broke the park into pieces, a faded sign with cartoon clouds peeling from it, rows of tilted ride seats, a dirt film ticket booth, the skeleton of an old game stall. Rot, metal, and water damage were enough. The place did not need anything dramatic to be dangerous. A responder tested a section of walkway before stepping on it. The board flexed. He redirected us around it. That 10-second detour felt like an hour. I thought about Paige in her purple sweatshirt. I thought about the way she had looked at me before leaving. You never listen. The sentence came back with every careful step. I wanted the chance to tell her she had been wrong. I wanted the chance to prove her right by listening until she ran out of words. Ahead of us, Rook disappeared behind a weather-beaten facade. When I reached the turn, My flashlight caught faded letters over an entrance. The haunted house. Of course I remembered it. Not well enough to map the interior, but well enough to remember the front. Fake stone, painted windows, grotesque faces that had once glowed under black light. Now half the decorative panels had fallen away. Water stains ran down the walls. One section of roofline sagged. Rook stood inside the entrance. He looked at me, then vanished deeper. "Paige!" My voice struck the walls and returned thinner. Nothing answered. Responders entered first. I remained where they told me, just inside the section they had cleared. Flashlights moved through abandoned corridors where scenery had peeled from damp walls. Bits of old track and guide rail remained along the floor from whatever ride system had once carried cars through the attraction. I called again. "Paige!" Nothing. One responder moved left. Another checked a side passage. Rook's nails clicked somewhere ahead, then stopped. My lungs began forgetting how to work normally. We were here. Rook had brought us here. Where was she? A responder called that the first accessible room was clear. Another section was checked. Clear. A corridor. Clear. An old control area. No Paige. The word clear, which I had once considered reassuring during searches, became unbearable. Clear meant she wasn't there. Clear meant keep going. Clear meant every second we had spent believing we were close might have been wrong. I pressed my fingers against my mouth. For the first time since Rook returned, a possibility entered my mind that I had been refusing to touch. Maybe he had brought us to where Paige had been, not where she was. Maybe she had left the building. Maybe someone had moved her. Maybe... No. I stopped the thought before it could grow limbs. Rook knew something. I had to trust what I knew about him without pretending it guaranteed the ending I wanted. A responder came back and told me they had not found Paige in the accessible upper section. My knees weakened. I put one hand against a wall and felt damp paint flake beneath my palm. Then why did he bring us here? The question was mostly for myself. Rook answered by refusing to leave. He had planted himself farther down the corridor beside an area where the floor changed abruptly. At first I thought he was staring into a dark opening. Then I heard him whine. Rook almost never whined while working, not even in retirement drills. He lowered himself until his chest nearly touched the floor and pushed his muzzle toward a broken section between warped boards. A responder approached cautiously. Rook stayed exactly where he was. The flashlight beam moved across the floor, then stopped. Several boards had fractured inward, not enough to create a clean hole from where I stood. The break was partly hidden beneath collapsed scenery and old structural material. The responder crouched without putting weight near the edge and shone his light down through a narrow opening. His posture changed. The maintenance level sat roughly 8 feet below the broken boards. There's a void underneath. My body moved before permission reached me. Someone caught my shoulder and kept me several feet back from the unstable section. I dropped to my knees anyway. "Paige!" Nothing. The responder leaned closer to the opening, listening. Rook pressed himself against the safe edge and stared downward. I called again. "Paige, baby, it's Mom." Silence. Not ordinary silence. The kind that grows until you can hear your own blood moving. I looked at the responder. He lifted one hand, asking everyone to stay quiet. Wind rattled something outside. A drop of water struck metal below us. Then nothing. I had spent the entire night telling myself what I would do when I found my daughter. I would hold her. I would apologize. I would take her home. I had not prepared for kneeling 6 feet from an opening and hearing no answer. My throat closed. I lowered myself as far as the responder allowed. "Paige." This time I did not shout. I said her name, the way I had when she was little and sick, in the middle of the night. The way I said it when she fell asleep in the car and I needed to wake her gently. The way only a mother says a child's name when she needs that child to know exactly who is calling. Several seconds passed. Then, from somewhere beneath the broken floor, so faint I almost thought my mind had made it. "Mom?" Every muscle in my body gave way at once. I dropped both hands to the floor. "I'm here." The responder beside me was already signaling the others. Radios came alive. Equipment was called forward. Nobody cheered, nobody moved recklessly. Paige was alive. That was all I understood. Alive. Beneath us. Rook let out a low sound and pressed his muzzle closer to the opening. I wanted to crawl through the broken boards with my bare hands. Instead, the rescue team stopped me. The structure around the collapse was unstable. Part of the old floor had dropped into a lower maintenance void, taking rotten boards and pieces of scenery with it. They could see enough to confirm Paige was down there. They could not simply climb in. They had to stabilize the section first. I knelt above the darkness with my daughter somewhere below me and listened as trained people prepared to reach her. For the first time that night, I knew exactly where Paige was, and I still could not touch her. Hearing Paige answer me should have made everything easier. Instead, it gave terror a location. Until that moment, fear had been spread across streets, woods, old service roads, every dark place my mind could invent. Now it was concentrated beneath a section of rotten flooring inside a condemned haunted house, close enough that I could hear my daughter and far enough that I could not reach her. The rescue team moved with a restraint that felt almost cruel until I forced myself to remember why it mattered. One firefighter tested the remaining floor around the collapse while another brought in shoring equipment. They could see part of the maintenance level through the broken boards, but years of moisture had weakened more than the section that had already fallen. Putting one adult's weight in the wrong place could send another portion down on top of Paige. Every instinct in me wanted speed. Everything that might actually save her required patience. I stayed where they put me. That was one of the hardest things I have ever done. Rook stayed too. Someone tried once to move him farther back from the damaged section, and he yielded only enough to reach the boundary the rescue captain allowed. Then he lowered himself onto his chest and fixed his eyes on the opening. He knew Paige was below. He also knew, in whatever simple language dogs build out of scent and routine, that I had found her now. His job had changed. So had mine. I could no longer search. I could only keep my daughter connected to the world above her. "Paige, can you hear me?" There was a pause before her voice came back. "Yes." Weak, but clear. A responder asked me not to make her talk continuously. They needed her awake and oriented, but they did not want her exhausting herself. Someone nearer the opening asked Paige a few basic questions: her name, whether she knew where she was, whether she could feel both feet, whether anything hurt badly when she breathed. I listened to every answer, as though it were a verdict. Her name was Paige Hayes. She knew I was there. Her right leg hurt, her hip hurt, she could move her toes. Breathing hurt only when she tried to take a very deep breath, and even then it sounded more like bruising than something catastrophic. She had not lost consciousness as far as she knew. No one promised me anything, but the rescue captain's shoulders loosened slightly after those answers. I noticed because mothers learn to read professionals the way frightened people read weather. A little less urgency in his movements became hope. I sat on the safest part of the floor they allowed me to use and kept one palm pressed flat against it. The boards were cold. I imagined Paige beneath them doing the same thing, although I had no idea whether she could reach the underside. "Mom, I'm here." That became our entire language for a while. She would say my name. I would tell her I was there. Nothing more was necessary. Metal supports clicked into place around the damaged floor. A firefighter worked down toward the lower maintenance space from a safer point farther along the structure, rather than dropping directly through the collapse. Another team cleared loose material. Every few minutes, someone updated me in ordinary words. They were making access. They could see her more clearly. She appeared pinned only by light debris rather than major structural pieces. Pinned. The word almost stopped my breathing. Then they clarified that she was not crushed. Several broken decorative panels and splintered boards had fallen around her. One piece lay across her lower leg, but did not appear heavily loaded. I held on to that distinction. Around her, not through her. Across. Not crushing. Language became something I used to survive, minute by minute. Paige told one of the rescuers she was cold. They lowered a thermal blanket before they could reach her fully. I heard the rescuer explain what was coming so she would not be frightened when it touched her in the dark. She gave a tiny, shaky laugh at something he said. I did not hear the words. I did hear the laugh. It lasted less than a second. It was the first sound from my daughter that belonged to the living world rather than the missing one. My eyes burned. I lowered my forehead toward my hand and stayed quiet because I did not want the next thing Paige heard from above to be me breaking apart. There would be time for that later. The structure groaned once when the team shifted a support. Every person froze. So did I. The sound stopped. Work resumed. That was what the rescue looked like from where I sat. Not heroics, not people throwing themselves through collapsing boards, but dozens of decisions designed to make sure one frightened child did not become two injured people or three. I understood that intellectually. My body understood only that Paige was still down there. Minutes stretched. Then one of the firefighters called up that they had reached her. I shut my eyes. The sentence moved through me, like warmth after hours outside. Reached her. Not found evidence of her. Not heard her. Reached her. A rescuer was physically beside my child. From there, the process remained careful. They checked her neck and head before moving anything around her. They freed the broken material from her leg. They stabilized the injured limb. They fitted protection around her before lifting. Paige cried out once. The sound cut through every layer of discipline I had left. I moved forward without meaning to. A hand touched my shoulder. Not hard, just enough. I stopped. The person holding me did not have to explain. If Paige was crying, Paige was breathing. If Paige could complain about pain, she was still here. I clung to the ugliest comfort I had ever been offered. When they finally began bringing her upward through the safer access they had opened, I saw Rook stand. His entire body changed. Ears forward, weight shifting, not barking, waiting. Then the stretcher appeared. For several seconds, Paige looked smaller than she had ever looked to me. Her purple sweatshirt was streaked with dust and dark grime. One sleeve had torn near the wrist. Her hair was tangled with bits of insulation and dried leaves. Superficial cuts marked one cheek and her hands. Nothing deep, but enough to show every place the old structure had touched her on the way down. Her right lower leg had been immobilized, and a blanket covered the rest of her almost to the chin. The injuries visible to me were frightening, but not catastrophic. She looked exactly like what she was. An exhausted 11-year-old child who had fallen through a rotten floor, spent too long cold and alone in the dark, and used nearly everything she had left staying awake. Her eyes moved across the faces above her, then found mine. I went to her only when the medic nodded. My hand touched hers. Paige's fingers closed around two of mine because the rest of her hand was scraped and taped around an IV line they had started as soon as they could. I wanted to put both arms around her. I wanted to lift her off the stretcher and carry her out myself. I did neither. I walked beside her. That was what she needed from me. Outside, emergency lights washed the abandoned park in red and white. Against the rusted rides and faded signs, the vehicles looked almost unreal. The cold air hit my face as soon as we stepped out of the haunted house. Paige shivered beneath the blanket. A medic adjusted it around her shoulders. They were checking her pulse, temperature, blood pressure, pupils, asking the smallest questions, monitoring everything I had spent the last hour fearing might stop. I kept my fingers inside hers. Halfway to the ambulance, Paige turned her head toward me. Her lips were pale. Her voice was barely stronger than it had been beneath the floor. "Mom? I'm right here." Her fingers tightened. Then she asked the question that finally broke something in me. "Are you still mad at me?" For a second, I could not understand what she meant. Not because the words were unclear, because my mind refused to place them inside the same night. My daughter had been tricked into a condemned amusement park. She had fallen through a floor. She had spent the evening injured in a dark maintenance void. And somewhere inside all of that, she was still carrying the unfinished science worksheet home with her. The confiscated phone, the door closing too hard, my irritated face, her own decision to leave. She thought those things were connected. She thought perhaps I had remained angry while she was lying beneath that building. Or worse, that what had happened to her might somehow belong to that anger. I bent close enough that she did not have to work to hear me. "There is nothing you could ever do that would make me leave you there." Her face crumpled. Not dramatically. Her mouth simply trembled, and tears slid sideways toward her hair. I pressed my forehead carefully against the side of hers, without disturbing anything the medics were doing. For most of the night, I had believed finding Paige would be the rescue. It wasn't. Not completely. Getting her body out of Skyland was only the first part. Somewhere between my kitchen and that broken floor, adults had taught my daughter that love could be withdrawn as punishment. I did not yet know how, but I knew I would spend however long it took teaching her the opposite. The ambulance took us to the hospital, while another vehicle remained at Skyland. Rook could not ride beside Paige in the patient compartment, and leaving him behind nearly caused the first panic she had shown since being extracted. A responder reassured her that he was safe and would be brought along separately with someone I trusted from the scene. That was enough to let the doors close. During the drive, Paige drifted between exhaustion and wakefulness. The paramedic kept her responsive without turning the ride into an interview. No one asked why she had been in Skyland. No one asked what my parents had done. Her injuries came first. I was grateful for that. I had questions burning holes through me. I swallowed every one. At the emergency department, imaging confirmed what the responders had suspected. Paige had a non-displaced fracture in her right lower leg. Painful, inconvenient, and destined to put her in a brace and then crutches for a while, but not the shattered bone my imagination had created. Her hip and thigh were heavily bruised but not fractured. The cuts were superficial. She was dehydrated and mildly chilled, with the kind of physical shock and exhaustion expected after an event like hers. No head injury, no internal bleeding, no surgery that night. Every negative finding felt like someone returning an object I had believed lost forever. I sat beside her while fluids ran through the IV and warmth slowly returned to her skin. Only after the doctors were satisfied she was stable did I allow myself to notice what had happened outside her room. My parents had come to the hospital. I saw Walter first, through the glass panel near the nurse's station. Diane stood beside him. My mother's face looked 20 years older than it had at dinner. For one dangerous moment, the child in me responded before the mother. My parents were here. Something terrible had happened. They should come in. That reflex lasted perhaps one heartbeat. Then I remembered Diane telling me Paige had never been at their house. Walter checking his watch. His knowledge of the maintenance road. My mother's phone inside Rook's pouch. I walked out of Paige's room and closed the door behind me. I did not scream. I did not accuse them of attempted murder. I did not tell a hallway full of strangers what kind of people I believed they were becoming. I told the nurse that Walter and Diane Mercer were not permitted in Paige's room that night. The nurse asked whether I was Paige's legal parent. I said yes, that was enough for the immediate situation. My mother started toward me. I raised one hand. Not tonight. Diane stopped. Her face twisted, in a way I would once have rushed to soften. She said they needed to see their granddaughter. I looked through the glass behind me. Paige was asleep for the moment, one hand lying open beside the blanket. No. It was the only answer I gave. Walter tried to explain that everyone was upset and that decisions made in anger could create permanent damage. The absurdity nearly took my breath away. He had spent my childhood telling me consequences mattered. Now that one had reached him, he wanted patience. I did not argue. I asked the nurse to make sure the restriction was documented for the night and went back inside. I was not yet making declarations about forever. I did not need to. For that night, the boundary was simple. Paige would not open her eyes and see the two people who had lied about where she had been. Several hours passed before anyone allowed a meaningful conversation about the park. By then, Paige's pain was controlled, her temperature was normal, and she had slept in short stretches. A medical professional remained involved, so no one turned an injured child into a source of entertainment or evidence. I sat beside her. I let other people decide when she was well enough to speak. When Paige finally woke more fully, she looked around the room, saw me, and relaxed enough that I could physically watch tension leave her forehead. Her first concern was Rook. I told her he was safe. Not long afterward, he was allowed into a permitted area just outside her room with supervision. Hospital rules did not disappear because he had saved my daughter, but someone had found a way to keep him close without pretending he had unlimited access. The first time Paige saw his gray muzzle through the doorway, her whole face changed. Only then did I understand how much of the night she had survived with him. She did not tell me the story all at once. That mattered. Trauma does not arrive organized into chapters. It comes out as pieces. A sound, a detail, a correction nobody knew needed correcting. Paige looked at me for a long time before saying the first important one. I didn't run away to the park. I kept my face still. I know. At that point, emotionally, I did. Factually, I still needed to hear what had happened. Paige swallowed. She told me Grandma and Grandpa had brought her. The room did not change. The monitor continued its soft rhythm. Fluids continued to drip through tubing. Somewhere outside, wheels squeaked along the hallway, but the entire shape of the night shifted. I had known my parents were lying. I had known Walter understood Skyland too well. I had known Diane's phone had somehow traveled from that park back to me. Knowing those pieces was different from hearing my daughter say, "They brought me there." Paige did not elaborate until she was ready. Walter and Diane had told her that I had gone looking for her. At Skyland. They said I thought she might have gone there, and that I had entered through an old access point. Paige had already been carrying guilt about leaving home after our argument. Hearing that I was supposedly out searching for her, because of what she had done, had been enough. She went with them. That detail hurt in a place anger could not reach. They had not forced her into a car. They had used me. Used the idea of me looking for her. Used a child's guilt after fighting with her mother. Paige told me they entered through an old employee gate. The memory came back to her in sounds. More than images. Metal rubbing metal. Walter handling the old chain. The heavy clink of links being pulled through the gate after Paige had gone inside. Then a smaller sound. Sharp. Final. A padlock clicking shut. Paige had turned around once. Through the gate, her grandparents were still there. They told her I had gone toward the old haunted house and that she needed to hurry if she wanted to find me. Then they left. My hands went cold. Until that moment, part of me had still been using the language everyone else was using. They left her at Skyland. They abandoned her there. Those statements were true. They were also incomplete. Walter had locked the gate. My parents had not merely driven away from a place Paige happened to be. They had confined an 11-year-old child inside a condemned amusement park. Paige had tried the gate once after she realized they were leaving. The chain held. Then she moved deeper into the park because she believed I was somewhere inside. Looking for her. She said that part quietly, almost apologetically. I thought you were mad, but I knew you'd still come. I could not answer immediately. The faith inside that sentence was almost unbearable. She had known I would come. My parents had known she would believe it. That was how they got her through the gate. I reached for her hand. This time, she gave me all 4 fingers. The next pieces came slower. She remembered moving through the old attraction, calling for me, realizing I was not answering, the floor giving beneath her, pain, darkness, Rook finding the broken section. I stopped her when her breathing changed. Not because I did not want the truth, because she did not owe me the entire night in one sitting. The rest could wait. She was alive. That was still enough. Later, when the room had quieted again, Rook was allowed to settle in the approved area near the doorway. A nurse guided him several feet farther from the entrance, so equipment could pass safely. Rook waited until she walked away. Then he stood, padded back to almost the exact place he had chosen before, turned 3 slow circles, and lay down. The nurse returned. She moved him again. Rook complied with the weary dignity of an elderly professional, accommodating an unreasonable coworker. 2 minutes later, he was back. On the 3rd attempt, the nurse stopped in the doorway and looked at me, then at Rook, then back at me. Her expression said she had finally identified the person in charge of the floor. A sound escaped me before I recognized it. Not quite laughter, but close. Paige smiled beneath the blanket. It was the first time I had seen her smile since the kitchen. The moment lasted only seconds. It did not erase anything. It was not supposed to. It was simply proof that terror had not taken every ordinary thing from us. Rook lowered his head onto his paws, as though the matter had been settled. For a little while, nobody tried to move him again. Paige slept. I watched her. The room grew quieter as the night deepened. A strip of hallway light lay across the floor beneath the door. The IV machine made small mechanical sounds that I would probably remember for the rest of my life. My parents were somewhere outside that room. I did not ask where. For the first time in my life, their feelings were not one of the problems I needed to solve. Near midnight, Paige woke again. She seemed clearer. Not stronger exactly, more present. She asked for water. I helped her take a few careful sips. Then she stared at the cup for a long moment. Something had changed in her face. I recognized the expression. It was the same one I had seen in my laundry room, days earlier, when she almost told me something, and then asked about a gray hoodie. The same one from the school parking lot, when she asked whether adults could get scared enough to make a stupid decision. I did not press her. I only sat there. Paige looked toward the doorway where Rook slept, then back at me. Grandma and Grandpa said they'd come back. I waited. When? She pulled the blanket slightly higher against her chest. When I was ready to promise. Her voice shrank. Promise what? This time the pause was long enough that I could hear the wheels of a cart pass outside and disappear down the corridor. Paige rubbed her thumb against the edge of the blanket. Then she said that I wouldn't tell anybody what Aunt Vanessa did. I felt the room narrow around me. Vanessa, my sister. The name made no sense inside anything I knew about that night. I did not ask Paige to explain. Not then. She had already given me more than enough. I helped her settle back against the pillow, held her hand until her eyes closed again, and sat in the dim room listening to her breathe. 4 words repeated themselves inside my head. What Aunt Vanessa did. Again. What Aunt Vanessa did. The science worksheet had not sent my daughter to Skyland. Our argument had not made my parents lock her inside that park. Whatever had happened had begun before Paige ever walked out my front door. And for the first time, I understood that the fight I had spent the entire evening blaming myself for had never been the real reason my parents took her there. By morning, the 4 words had worn a groove through my mind. What Aunt Vanessa did. Paige slept in uneven stretches, while the hospital settled into that strange hour, when night had technically ended, but daylight had not yet reached the windows. Every time she moved beneath the blanket, I looked up. Every time the monitor changed rhythm because she shifted or sighed, My body reacted before my thoughts caught up. I had not called Vanessa. I had not called anyone except the people who needed to know Paige was alive. For years, Vanessa had been the person my parents called first whenever something threatened the family's balance. If she needed help, information moved quickly. If she had made a mistake, information moved carefully. By morning, I understood enough to know I was not going to continue that tradition by warning her before I understood what Paige had been carrying. So I waited. Not because I wanted to interrogate my daughter, because for the first time all week, Paige had finally reached the place where she had been trying to get me. When she woke again, the light outside had turned the hospital window gray. The swelling around her injured leg had been checked. Her pain medication had taken the sharpest edge off the fracture, and a nurse helped reposition her without making her sit fully upright. I watched her face until the tension around her mouth eased. Then I asked whether she wanted to tell me what she had meant about Vanessa. I made sure she knew she did not have to tell everything at once. Paige stared at the blanket for a while. When she finally began, she did not start with Vanessa driving away. She started with the sound. A hard impact. Metal and something lighter striking together. Several days before our argument, Paige had been near a quiet intersection when Vanessa's SUV came through. A cyclist was crossing ahead of her. Paige saw the vehicle hit him, not at highway speed. Not some spectacular collision with a body flying through the air the way television teaches people to imagine accidents. The reality sounded almost more frightening because of how ordinary it was. A vehicle moving where it should have stopped, a person suddenly on pavement, a bicycle bent beneath one wheel. Vanessa stopped. She got out. That detail mattered to Paige. My sister had not driven away, without knowing anything had happened. She had stood beside the road. The cyclist was moving. Paige saw him trying to lift himself, saw one arm move, heard him making enough sound that she knew he was alive. Vanessa looked around. Then she got back into the SUV and drove away. Another motorist came upon the scene shortly afterward and stopped. That person called 911. Paige had never seen anything like it, neither had I. As she told me, she kept pressing her thumbnail into the soft edge of the hospital blanket. I thought maybe she was getting her phone. The sentence was so childlike that it hurt. For a few seconds after the collision, Paige had apparently been trying to create the version in which the adult she knew was still doing the right thing. Vanessa would get her phone. Vanessa would move the vehicle out of traffic. Vanessa would come back. Then the SUV kept going. Paige knew whose vehicle it was. She knew who had been driving, and because she was 11, she did not immediately think about criminal liability or insurance or legal exposure. She thought an adult had done something frightening. So she went looking for other adults. That was the part I had not been prepared for. She did not come home and tell me first. She went to my parents. When Paige said it, I felt a small, selfish wound open before I could stop it. I wanted to ask why she had not come to me. Then I remembered the haunted house, the locked gate, her question on the stretcher. "Are you still mad at me?" This was not the moment to turn her truth into another test she had failed. So I listened. Paige had gone to Walter and Diane because she did not know what she was supposed to do. She was afraid Vanessa would be in trouble. She was afraid the cyclist might be badly hurt. She was also afraid that if she told me, something enormous would happen immediately, and she would be the person who caused it. She thought her grandparents would know how to help her tell me, not how to hide it. Help her tell me. That distinction landed harder than almost anything else she had said. Paige had approached the two people who later locked her inside Skyland because she trusted their judgment. She had not come carrying an accusation. She had come asking for guidance. Diane's first response had been to introduce doubt. Maybe Paige had not seen the vehicle clearly. Maybe she had mistaken what happened. Maybe Vanessa had only been near the scene. Paige insisted she knew her aunt's SUV. She knew Vanessa. Then my mother shifted. Accidents happened. People panicked. Vanessa might have reacted badly for a few minutes without being a bad person. That was probably true. It was also not the question Paige had asked. The question was what they should do. Diane turned that question into something else. What would happen to Vanessa if Paige told? Her job, her marriage, her reputation, police, insurance. Everything she had built. By the time my mother finished, the injured cyclist had almost disappeared from the moral equation. The central problem had become the damage Paige's words might cause Vanessa. Walter took a different route to the same destination. He spoke about loyalty. Paige did not repeat every sentence. I did not need her to. I knew my father's vocabulary. Families handled things carefully. People should not destroy someone they loved over a mistake. A child might see one moment without understanding the whole situation. There were proper ways to deal with problems, and blurting things out while emotional was not one of them. All the language of responsibility, placed around the wrong person. Paige told them she had seen Vanessa driving. She refused to say otherwise. That was when the conversations changed. Not all at once. No one leaned over a table and announced that Paige was forbidden to speak. It was slower. Questions whenever she visited. Had she reconsidered? Was she really sure? Could she live with herself if Vanessa lost everything because she refused to let one accident go? Paige carried those questions home, and I had watched the weight of them without recognizing what I was seeing. The gray hoodie, the unfinished homework, her staring through the windshield after school. If adults ever got scared enough to make a stupid decision, suddenly, the entire previous week rearranged itself in my memory. I had thought Paige was becoming secretive because she was 11. I had thought the sharpness in her voice was a new stage of independence. I had thought the half-finished science worksheet and the lie about completing it were ordinary defiance. Maybe part of them were. Children are still children even while terrible things are happening around them. But underneath the small behaviors was something I had not seen. Paige had been waking up every morning knowing that an injured stranger existed somewhere because her aunt had left him on a road. She had been going to school knowing the adults she trusted wanted her to doubt her own eyes. She had been coming home to me while believing that telling me the truth could tear apart the family. My guilt changed shape. For hours, I had punished myself with one thought. I caused the argument. Then a different version replaced it. I had not caused what my parents did, but I had mistaken distress for defiance. That was painful without being the same thing. The distinction mattered. I could regret missing what Paige was trying to tell me, without accepting responsibility for adults who chose to frighten her into silence. Paige looked at me carefully. You were already mad about the worksheet. There it was again. The instinct to measure how much truth our relationship could survive. I took her hand. I was mad that you lied about finishing it. She looked down. And I would still have wanted you to tell me this. Her eyes lifted. Even about Aunt Vanessa? Especially something like this. I did not promise what I would have done afterward. I did not tell an 11-year-old how the police should handle a collision or what consequences Vanessa deserved. I only gave Paige the part that belonged to us. She was allowed to tell me the truth, even if I was angry, even if the truth involved somebody I loved, even if the truth created consequences. That was when she told me why she had gone to Walter and Diane the night of our argument. Until then, I had understood the sequence this way. Paige got angry with me, left home, went to her grandparents, and they exploited the situation. That was true. It was not complete. Paige had been angry. She had wanted distance from me. But she also had a plan. She intended to ask my parents to come back with her. She wanted them standing beside her when she told me what Vanessa had done. My daughter had walked out after telling me I never listened while planning to return, and trust me with the most frightening truth she had ever carried. She had not been running from me. Not really. She had been trying to find enough courage to come back. That realization hurt worse than the argument itself. For 4 days, Paige had been standing on one side of a truth, looking for adults to help her cross it. Walter and Diane had not simply refused. They had turned the bridge in the wrong direction. The night Paige appeared at their house, she told them she was done waiting. She would tell me. She wanted them to help. Instead, they told her I had already gone looking for her, at Skyland, because I supposedly believed she might have gone there after our fight. The lie worked precisely because of the guilt they knew she already carried. Paige thought I had left the house and gone searching through a dangerous place because she had stormed out. My parents had not invented her guilt. They had weaponized it. I looked away from Paige for a moment and stared through the hospital window. Morning had finally reached the parking lot. Cars moved below. People entered carrying coffee. Somewhere in the building, life was beginning an ordinary Monday. I wanted to return to the previous week and notice everything differently. I wanted to sit beside Paige at the kitchen table when she stared at the unfinished worksheet and ask one more question. I wanted to refuse the easy explanation that 11-year-olds became moody. But regret is not a door. It is a window. You can look through it. You cannot climb back. So I stayed where I was. When Paige grew tired, I let the conversation stop. Later that morning, after she had rested and eaten a few bites of breakfast, she told me about the phone. Until then, I knew only what I had physically seen. Rook arriving at my parents' property with Diane's cracked phone inside the utility pouch on his working harness. I had understood that Paige must somehow have put it there. I had not known how the phone reached her. Diane had given it to Paige herself. At Skyland. The attraction was dark, and my mother told Paige she could use the phone as a flashlight while she looked for me. That one practical gesture explained everything. Diane expected to come back. She expected Paige to still have the phone. She expected to retrieve both later. The phone was never supposed to become evidence of where they had taken her. It was supposed to be temporary light inside the fear they had planned. Paige still had it when the floor collapsed. The impact cracked the screen. After she stopped falling and understood she could not climb out, she tried to make a call. The phone showed no usable signal from the maintenance space beneath the attraction. She tried again. Nothing. Rook found her. He stayed near the opening above her, pacing, lowering his muzzle toward the gap, returning every time she called him. For a while, Paige did not want him to leave. She admitted that part with embarrassment, as though fear in an 11-year-old trapped below a collapsing building required an apology. She had already watched her grandparents drive away. The idea of Rook disappearing too had been unbearable. Then she remembered his harness, the same flat pouch she had used in our yard, the same simple drill we had turned into a game. My glove in the pouch. Back. Rook retracing the route. The drill had never been designed for abandoned amusement parks. I had taught it because retired search dogs still needed work, because Paige enjoyed training with him, because simple return behaviors were useful when you lived with an animal whose brain had spent years attaching meaning to tasks. Paige had turned an ordinary family exercise into a way out. She called Rook close enough to reach the harness, where he leaned down near the broken edge. She placed Diane's phone into the utility pouch, closed the zipper, then she used the command. Back! Rook hesitated. Paige said it again. This time he left. She told me the worst part had been listening until she could no longer hear his nails above her. For a few minutes, she thought she had made a mistake. Maybe he would get lost. Maybe he would simply go home. Maybe no one would understand why a dog had arrived carrying a phone. I thought about Rook emerging behind my parents' house. Mud. Rust. His paw striking the pouch, then running back toward the service lane. He had done exactly what he knew how to do. Nothing supernatural. Nothing impossible. A familiar route. A familiar command. A task completed in the only language Paige and Rook shared well enough to use when everything else failed. I squeezed her hand. You sent him to me. Paige shook her head slightly. I hoped he'd find you. For some reason, that correction mattered. She had not known I would be at Walter and Diane's house. She had not designed a perfect rescue. She had made the best decision available to a frightened child in the dark and trusted a dog she loved to do what he had always done. Go back. Hours later, the cracked phone delivered one more piece of that night. It had already been handled carefully because of how and where it was found. When its contents were accessed, there was a short video Paige had recorded while trapped below the haunted house floor. She had opened the camera from the lock screen after another attempt to connect failed. No speech prepared for police, no explanation of motives, no names arranged neatly for adults. The clip lasted less than 20 seconds. Someone showed it to me. I almost asked them not to. Then Paige said it was okay. The image shook badly. Most of the screen was darkness, and the pale blur of her own face lit by the phone. Her voice sounded smaller than I remembered it sounding from above the floor. "Mom, I didn't run to the park. Grandma and Grandpa brought me. Rook's here. I'm sorry we fought." Then the clip ended. I could not watch it twice. The words about Walter and Diane mattered. I knew they would matter to the investigation, but the sentence that broke me was the last one. "I'm sorry we fought." Trapped beneath a rotten floor with an injured leg and no usable signal, Paige had still believed there was something unfinished between us that she needed to repair. I bent forward until my forehead rested against the heel of my hand. Nobody in the room tried to speak for a while. Paige watched me. I wiped my face before turning toward her. "You never have to apologize for surviving an argument with me." That earned the faintest crease at the corner of her mouth. Not a smile exactly, but close enough. By early afternoon, I was beginning to understand how much of the night had been built out of ordinary things twisted into weapons. A family habit of letting Paige cool down at her grandparents' house. Her trust in them. My rule about homework. Her guilt after leaving. Diane's phone. Rook's training. None of those things had been dangerous by themselves. Intent changed them. Choice changed them. That realization stayed with me when Vanessa arrived. I saw her before she saw me. She came through the hospital corridor quickly, coat unbuttoned, hair pulled back without the careful polish she usually wore outside the house. Her face looked drained. For one moment I saw my sister, not the favored child, not the woman behind Paige's secret. Just Vanessa, 3 years older than me, hurrying toward a hospital room because her niece had nearly died. That moment mattered, because what came next would have been easier if I could convince myself Vanessa had never loved Paige. People prefer simple villains. Families rarely provide them. Vanessa saw me and stopped. Her eyes went immediately toward Paige's door. I stepped into the center of the hallway. She asked whether Paige was all right. I gave her only what was necessary. Alive. Stable. Recovering. Vanessa closed her eyes for half a second. Relief passed across her face so clearly that I believed it. Then she looked at me again. Something else entered. Fear. Not fear for Paige. Fear of what Paige had said. I knew the difference now. I did not tell Vanessa what I knew about the intersection. I did not mention the cyclist. I did not mention the phone video. I simply said that Paige had started telling me what happened. Vanessa's face changed. She looked toward the door again, then toward the far end of the hall, as if checking whether Walter or Diane were nearby. And before I accused her of anything, before I asked whether she had been driving, before I even said the word Skyland, my sister gave me her first defense. I never told them to take her there. The precision of the sentence was almost worse than a confession. Not, "What are you talking about?" Not, "Take her where?" Not, "Why would Mom and Dad do that?" Vanessa already knew there was a difference between what she had wanted and what my parents had done. She knew enough to separate herself from the location, from the method, from the locked gate. I stared at her. Behind me, Paige slept beneath a hospital blanket because Walter and Diane had decided terror could be administered in controlled amounts. In front of me stood the person whose mistake they had been trying to protect. Vanessa had just told me, without meaning to, that the question was no longer whether she was involved, only how. I kept my voice low because there were patients on both sides of us, and because I no longer needed volume to make my sister uncomfortable. Then what exactly did you ask them to do? Vanessa opened her mouth. Nothing came out. For the first time in my life, my parents were not there to answer for her. Vanessa stood in the hospital hallway with my question between us. Then what exactly did you ask them to do? For several seconds, she looked everywhere except at me. At Paige's closed door. At the nurse's station. At the floor polished so clean, the overhead lights reflected in it. When she finally answered, her voice was low. She had asked our parents to keep Paige from saying anything that night. Not forever, she insisted. Just that night. Vanessa said she had panicked after the collision. By the time she understood Paige had seen her, she had already lied about what happened. Already let hours pass without correcting it. And every additional hour made the next honest one harder. She told herself she needed one evening to think, to speak with her husband, to understand what she might lose. She claimed she intended to come to me the next day. That distinction mattered. It simply did not save her. You asked two adults to stop an 11-year-old from telling her mother the truth. Vanessa flinched. She said she had never imagined Skyland. Never imagined a locked gate or leaving Paige alone. She had expected Mom and Dad to talk to her, to persuade her to wait. The word persuade almost made me laugh, but there was nothing funny in it. My sister had grown up inside the same family I had. She knew exactly what talk to her meant when Walter wanted obedience and Diane wanted a version of events that kept everyone comfortable. Maybe Vanessa had not pictured an abandoned amusement park, but she had handed our parents a problem with one instruction attached: make the child stop talking. Then she had allowed herself not to ask how. That was not mastermind guilt. It was something more ordinary and, in its own way, more disturbing. Cowardice with delegation. I told Vanessa that not choosing the park did not make her innocent. Her eyes filled, but she did not argue. For once, my sister had no defense delivered to her in advance. Watching her stand there without Walter correcting the wording or Diane smoothing the edges brought back a memory I had not thought about in years. I was 13. Vanessa was 16. Our parents had bought us each a small camera before a family trip. Mine was cheap, bright silver, and I loved it because it was the first thing I owned that felt chosen entirely for me. Vanessa borrowed it without asking, because hers had run out of film and then left mine on a bench at a park. When we went back, it was gone. I cried. Not for hours. Not theatrically. I was 13 and had lost something I cared about because my sister took it. Vanessa cried harder. She felt terrible, Diane explained. Walter said Vanessa had already learned her lesson from how guilty she felt. Then my mother turned to me and used a sentence she would use in different forms for years. "You're the stronger one, Mallory." At 13, I heard it as praise. Strong people could absorb disappointment. Strong people could let things go. Strong people did not need restitution if demanding it made someone else feel worse. The camera was never replaced. Vanessa's guilt became the injury everyone attended to. My loss became the thing I was expected to carry quietly, because apparently I had the stronger arms. Standing outside Paige's room, I finally saw the rule hidden inside that memory. Protect Vanessa. Redistribute the cost. That was what my parents had always done. The costs had simply been smaller before. A camera, an inconvenience, an apology, a ruined afternoon. Now the cost had been assigned to my daughter. Vanessa wiped beneath one eye. She said my name as though she wanted me to understand that she truly had planned to tell me. I believed she might have. That was almost worse, because tomorrow had always been one of Vanessa's safest places. Tomorrow she would fix it. Tomorrow she would explain. Tomorrow she would face whatever she had spent today avoiding. The cyclist had needed help when she hit him. Paige had needed protection when she told the truth. Neither of them had lived in Vanessa's tomorrow. I told her Paige needed rest and that she would not be entering the room. Vanessa did not challenge me. She nodded once and walked away down the corridor. I watched her go without feeling victorious. There was no victory in discovering exactly how much guilt belonged to your sister. There was only proportion. And for the first time in my family, I intended to leave each person carrying their own. When I returned to Paige's room, she was awake. Her color was better. The frightening paleness from the night before had softened, and the pain medication had allowed her to rest without erasing her completely. Her injured leg remained elevated and immobilized, and she moved carefully when adjusting herself. But the doctors were satisfied with the direction of her recovery. Physical recovery had steps: follow-up imaging, a brace, crutches later, when she was ready. Weeks rather than days. That made sense to me. Bones had timelines. Bruises changed colors. Cuts closed. The injury I could not measure was the one behind her eyes. She asked whether Vanessa had been outside. I told her yes. Paige watched my face. Is she mad at me? The question was quiet. I pulled my chair closer. No. It would have been easy to tell Paige Vanessa had no right to be angry. True, but incomplete. The deeper problem was that Paige still believed Vanessa's feelings were something she might be responsible for managing. I told her the adults would handle what happened next. Her job was to heal and tell the truth when she felt able, not protect anyone from what the truth meant. She thought about that, then asked if Grandma was crying. I closed my eyes for a second. Even after everything, Paige was still Paige. Empathy had survived the haunted house. I did not want to destroy that goodness just because other people had exploited it. So I told her I did not know, and that if Diane was crying, those feelings belonged to Diane. Paige did not have to fix them. That sentence felt new in my mouth. I wished someone had given it to me when I was 13. Later that morning, my mother demonstrated exactly why. A nurse told me Walter and Diane were still in the hospital and had asked to speak with me. They were not being allowed into Paige's room. That boundary remained in place. At first I refused. Then I reconsidered. Not because they deserved access to me, because I needed to understand one remaining piece. They had said they were coming back. Paige remembered it. Walter had checked his watch repeatedly while we searched. I wanted to know why. I agreed to speak with them away from Paige's room. A staff member showed us to a small family consultation area off the main corridor. I made sure someone knew where I was, and that I would not be gone long. Walter sat with both hands resting on his knees. Diane held a paper cup she had not drunk from. Neither looked like the parents I had spent my life knowing, but neither looked like monsters either. That was important. Monsters are comforting, because they are easy to separate from yourself. Walter looked like a tired 68-year-old man who used to sharpen my ice skates in winter. Diane looked like the woman who kept Paige's favorite cereal in her pantry. They had done something monstrous without transforming into creatures from another world. Human beings were capable of that, which meant excuses mattered even less. Walter started with the sentence I already knew he would use. They were going back. I asked when. His eyes shifted. 45 minutes. For a moment I thought I had misheard him. Then he explained that he had set an alarm on his watch when he locked the gate. 45 minutes. In his mind, that was enough time for Paige to understand that they were serious. Enough time to frighten her without placing her in real danger. When the alarm sounded, they intended to return, unlock the gate, bring her home, and make sure she understood the importance of keeping quiet until the adults handled Vanessa's situation. I stared at his wrist and remembered every time he had checked it while my daughter was missing. He had not been checking the hour because he was nervous. He had been measuring the distance from his own deadline. Around 7:03. By then, I was at their house. They had already told me Paige had never arrived, and law enforcement was coming. The lie trapped them. Walter reached the moment when his planned punishment was supposed to end and chose not to reveal where Paige was because doing so would expose what he and Diane had done. The floor collapse had been an accident. The darkness, locked gate, fear, and 45-minute limit had not. My father had treated an 11-year-old's terror like something he could dose and stop on schedule. What if she'd panicked after 10 minutes? I asked. Walter said they believed she would stay near the route they had described. What if she tried to climb the fence? He looked away. What if she fell? His mouth tightened. Then he returned to the only defense he had left. We were coming back. You planned the end of it, I said. That doesn't erase that you planned the beginning. Diane finally spoke. She said everything had gone farther than she intended. Walter turned toward her. Something in the way he looked at my mother changed the room. Until then, they had still presented themselves as a unit. A terrible decision made together. Under pressure, that unity cracked. Walter said Diane was the one who told him Paige needed to be frightened enough to understand the seriousness of what she was threatening to do. Diane's face sharpened. She said Walter was the one who chose Skyland. He knew the employee gate. He brought the chain and padlock. He decided 45 minutes. Neither shouted. They did not need to. Their sentences crossed the small table like people pushing a heavy object back and forth because neither wanted it left on their side. Walter controlled the method. Diane supplied the moral permission. He had a place. She had a justification. He knew how to lock a gate. She knew how to make an 11-year-old believe telling the truth was betrayal. Separately, each could still point at the other. Together, they had built exactly what happened. Then Diane said Paige would never have gone inside if Walter had not lied about where I was. Walter answered that Paige would never have needed a lesson if Diane and Vanessa had not spent days letting the situation grow. There it was. The family instinct I knew better than any childhood photograph. Find the nearest person who can carry the cost. I remembered another afternoon. I had been 15. Vanessa took a blouse from my room without asking before a family dinner. It was one of the few clothes I had bought with money from a summer job. She spilled something on it and tore a seam near the cuff. When I saw it, I confronted her in the hallway. I was angry. I spoke too loudly. Diane heard. By the end of the evening, the subject was no longer Vanessa taking my blouse. The subject was my tone. I had embarrassed my sister in front of relatives. I had made dinner uncomfortable. I had overreacted to something that could be repaired. Somehow, I ended up standing beside Vanessa's bedroom door, apologizing for yelling. No one ever asked Vanessa to apologize for taking the blouse. For years, I remembered that as evidence that I had a temper when I was young. Sitting across from Diane now, I understood what had really happened. She had changed the meaning of the event until the reaction became the offense. She was doing it again. Paige witnessed Vanessa leave an injured cyclist. That became Paige threatening Vanessa's future. Paige resisted pressure. That became Paige needing discipline. I argued with my daughter. That became the reason Paige disappeared. The floor collapsed. Now that would become Walter choosing the wrong place. Every time reality pointed toward responsibility, my mother rotated it until someone else stood beneath the light. I pushed my chair back. No, both of them stopped. I told them Paige would not become the place where they settled their shares of blame. They would not go into her room and explain that one of them meant less harm than the other. They would not ask whether she remembered a sentence differently. They would not tell her Vanessa was sorry and wait for the child to make everybody feel better. They would not confront her with competing versions of what happened. There would be no family meeting around her hospital bed, no forced reconciliation. No adults using her as the audience for their defenses. My mother started to say Paige deserved to hear their side. I stood. She survived your side. I left before anger could turn the conversation into something less useful. Back in Paige's room, I spoke with her medical team and the people coordinating the next steps. I did not need to become an expert in child interviews or investigations. My request was simpler. Paige had already told essential pieces while injured. I wanted unnecessary repetition minimized. If trained people needed information from her, it should happen when medically appropriate, in a way that did not make her relive the night for every adult who entered the room. And Walter, Diane, and Vanessa would have no direct access to question her. Nobody argued with that. For the first time since Paige disappeared, I felt the part of myself that worked in operations return. At my job, panic never fixed a delayed shipment or a broken supply chain. You identified what still had to happen, who had access, where failure could repeat, and you removed unnecessary points of risk. My daughter was not a logistics problem, but protection still had practical steps. Love that lived only in feelings would not be enough. I took out my phone. Walter and Diane were listed as approved pickup contacts at Paige's school. I removed them. They were secondary emergency contacts. Removed. They had standing permission to pick Paige up from after-school activities if I was delayed. Gone. My mother had been listed as someone medical offices could contact when I could not be reached. I withdrew that authorization too. I was Paige's sole active legal parent. I did not need a judge to tell me I could stop giving my parents privileges I had personally granted. I sent the necessary notices and made a note to follow up with the school office directly when it opened fully for the day. These were not revenge moves. No dramatic speeches accompanied them. No one applauded. A name disappeared from one field, then another, and with each small administrative change, a belief I had carried for years disappeared too. Grandparent did not mean guardian. Grandparent did not mean automatic access. Grandparent did not mean safe. I had given Walter and Diane authority because I trusted them. They had used that authority to get my daughter into a utility cart and through a locked gate. The permission ended there. By afternoon, Paige was awake longer at a time. A physical therapist had not yet begun any serious mobility work. Her leg needed proper follow-up first, and no one pretended she would be walking normally the next morning. But she could sit more comfortably, eat a little, complain that hospital apple juice tasted like someone described an apple to water, and ask when she could go home. That complaint almost made me smile. Almost. I told her I needed to step into the hallway for a minute to speak with the nurse about discharge planning and follow-up. Paige's hand shot out. Not hard, fast. Her fingers caught my sleeve. The reaction was so immediate that neither of us seemed to understand it at first. Her eyes went to the door. How long? 1 minute. You're coming back? I sat down again. Everything inside me went quiet. This was the same child who, 2 days earlier, could disappear into her bedroom for an hour and act offended if I knocked. Now, 60 seconds beyond a doorway sounded dangerous. I placed my hand over hers. Yes, I'm coming back. Paige nodded, but she did not release my sleeve. So I stayed another minute. Then I told her exactly what I was doing. I would walk to the nurse's station. She could see part of it through the glass. I would speak to one person, then I would return. No vague, be right back. No disappearing. No making her prove she trusted me. When I stood again, she let go. I walked to the nurse's station. I did not hurry, because I did not want her to see panic. I did not linger, because I had made a promise. Less than 2 minutes later, I came back through the door. Paige looked at me. Something in her face loosened. That tiny change hurt more than any accusation could have. The fracture would heal in weeks. The lesson Walter and Diane had tried to teach her might take much longer to undo. They wanted Paige to learn that people could leave when she refused to obey. I would have to teach the opposite through repetition. I say, I am coming back. Then, I come back. Again and again. Until her body believed what my words alone could not fix. Near evening, Diane made one last attempt to speak with me before leaving the hospital. I met her outside Paige's room. She had been told about the access changes. I could see that in her face before she spoke. For once, she did not tell me I was overreacting. She did not mention Vanessa. She did not say the floor collapse was unforeseen. Instead, she reached for the oldest argument she had. Blood. We are still her grandparents. She said it as though it were not a relationship, but a deed. Something recorded permanently, something no action could cancel. I looked through the glass at Paige lying in bed, Rook resting nearby, and finally understood that my parents still believed the same thing they had believed when they locked that gate. They believed family gave them rights. What they had never understood was that family also gave them responsibilities. And they had spent so many years protecting blood that they had forgotten the difference. By the third morning after Skyland, I had learned that the truth rarely arrived in the order people deserved to hear it. It came in pieces. A child's sentence from a hospital bed, a cracked phone inside a dog's harness, a father knowing a maintenance road he should not have known mattered, a mother who could not explain why her own phone had returned from the place she insisted her granddaughter had never been. And then, once Paige was medically stable enough that the world around us could begin moving again, the pieces started acquiring edges. Investigators did not treat every frightened recollection or family accusation as fact simply because emotions were high. They preserved what could be preserved, compared timelines, collected statements, and separated what someone believed from what could be corroborated. I appreciated that more than I expected. By then, I no longer needed anyone to tell me my parents had lied. I needed the truth to become stronger than our family's habit of changing it. Paige had been moved out of the hospital's highest observation stage and into the slower, less frightening part of recovery. Her leg remained immobilized. She was still not allowed to put weight on it. Getting from the bed to a chair took help, patience, and more energy than she wanted to admit. She hated needing assistance. That, more than the fracture itself, made her look 11 again. One morning she tried to reach a dropped hair tie without asking me, discovered that 6 inches might as well have been 6 miles, and stared at the floor as though it had personally betrayed her. Rook watched from his approved spot. When I picked up the hair tie, Paige muttered that at least one of us still had working legs. Rook thumped his tail once. He's mocking me. He's retired. He has time. She gave him a suspicious look. It was one of those small moments I had wanted back, while kneeling over the broken floor. Ordinary irritation. A complaint. Something almost funny. For a few minutes, I could pretend the hardest thing in the room was a hair tie. Then my phone rang. The investigator working through the family communications wanted to confirm a message connected to Vanessa. I stepped into the corridor before taking the call. I already knew Vanessa had admitted asking our parents to keep Paige quiet that night. She had told me herself. But hearing that admission and seeing the exact words were different things. The preserved message had been sent from Vanessa to Diane before Paige arrived at my parents' house. It read, "Just make sure she understands she can't say anything tonight." That was all I was given at first. 1 sentence, 16 words. I read it twice, then a third time. Every charitable interpretation I had managed to build around Vanessa over the previous day collapsed. She had told me she never asked them to frighten Paige. The message did not say frighten. It was worse because it did not specify anything. Make sure. She understands. She can't say anything. The language of a person assigning a task while keeping her own hands clean. My mind filled in the rest faster than evidence could. Did Vanessa know they would take Paige to Skyland? Had she known about the locked gate? Had she told them to do whatever it took? Had the story she gave me in the hallway been another carefully reduced version designed to preserve the smallest possible piece of innocence? For years, Vanessa's specialty had been living inside the safest definition of what she had technically done. I didn't steal your camera. I borrowed it. I didn't lie. I left something out. I didn't ask them to hurt Paige. The message made that last sentence feel suddenly engineered. I went back into Paige's room, carrying more anger than I wanted her to see. She noticed anyway. Children always notice the things adults congratulate themselves for hiding. She asked if something had happened. I told her an adult message had been found that needed to be understood properly and that she did not need to worry about it. Paige watched me carefully. Was it about me? I hesitated. That was answer enough. Her shoulders sank. I pulled my chair closer. The adults are sorting out what the adults said and did. That is not your job. She nodded. But the line between understanding a sentence and believing it was still too wide, I could see that. So could Rook. He stood, stretched his front legs one at a time, then pressed his head against the side of Paige's mattress until she scratched between his ears. The investigator contacted me again later, after obtaining the fuller thread through the proper process. Vanessa had not deleted the conversation. More importantly, when asked to preserve and provide access to relevant communications, she had not suddenly claimed her phone was lost, broken, or unavailable. That did not make her brave. It meant she had finally stopped making the truth harder to reach. The longer thread contained another message, sent after the one that had hit me like an instruction. Don't scare her. I'll tell Mallory tomorrow. Just give me tonight. I stared at those words even longer than the first set. The emotional effect was not relief. It was irritation of a different kind. Because now the truth refused to remain simple. Vanessa had not ordered Skyland. She had not asked Walter to chain a gate. She had not told Diane to make Paige think her mother was searching inside an abandoned attraction. The fuller thread supported what she had already told me. She wanted one night. She expected our parents to pressure Paige. She specifically told them not to scare her. Then Walter and Diane took the goal she gave them and chose their own method. For a few hours, anger had offered me something easy. Vanessa planned everything. There was the villain. There was the answer. Now reality handed me something more complicated. Vanessa had not designed the terror. She had simply created the demand for silence and trusted two people who had spent a lifetime shielding her from consequences to accomplish it. That was not innocence. It was differentiated guilt. I understood the distinction intellectually before I accepted it emotionally. When Vanessa came to the hospital that afternoon, I met her in the same consultation room where Walter and Diane had told me about the 45-minute plan. She looked more tired than the last time. No makeup, hair tied loosely. Her phone was in her hand. For most of our adult lives, Vanessa had been the polished one in family pictures. The person who looked as though she had remembered something everyone else had forgotten. Seeing her disordered did not satisfy me. It only made the conversation feel more real. I told her I had seen the full thread. Her eyes closed briefly. She did not ask which part. She knew. I told her the second message mattered. Don't scare her, mattered. It showed she had not asked for what Walter and Diane eventually did. Vanessa exhaled. I watched relief begin to appear. Then I stopped it. But so does the first one. The relief disappeared. I did not repeat the entire message. She knew her own words. I told her that asking two adults to keep a child silent was still a choice. Wanting Paige pressured rather than terrified did not erase the fact that Vanessa had made Paige's truth a problem to be managed. She said she understood. I was not sure she did. Not fully. So I gave her the version I wished someone had given us, as children. If you hand someone a dirty job because you don't want to watch how they do it, you don't become clean. Vanessa looked down at her phone. I told her she had wanted one more consequence-free night. That was the part I understood now. Not forever. Not even a week. Just one more evening in which her marriage was still intact, her job still safe, her name still separate from the collision. One night. And for that one night to exist, Paige had to carry everything Vanessa did not want to carry. The memory of the cyclist, the fear of telling me, my parents' pressure, the idea that speaking might destroy someone's life. That was the exchange. Vanessa's calm, purchased with my daughter's anxiety. I said I'd tell you the next morning. I know. I meant it. I believe you. That answer surprised her. It surprised me too, but I did believe she intended to tell me. The problem was that intention had become the excuse. Tomorrow had protected Vanessa from today. Vanessa pressed both hands together. For once, she did not ask me to understand how scared she had been. That helped more than an apology would have. The next major piece came from outside the family. The old service route behind my parents' property eventually passed close enough to a small building supply and equipment business that one exterior camera captured part of the lane. I remembered the place once investigators described the angle. During the search, we had passed the back edge of the property without my giving it any real attention. A light mounted high near the loading area, a security camera above it, the kind of ordinary object you stop seeing because every warehouse, repair shop, and storage yard seems to have one. The camera did not record Skyland. It did not show the employee gate. It did not capture Paige being locked inside. Thank God for that, in a way. There was something unbearable about the idea of watching that moment. What the footage did show was simpler. Walter's utility cart. At the relevant time, it moved along the service route towards Skyland. 3 human figures were visible. The image was not close enough for faces. It did not need to be. The cart itself was recognizable. Its return happened within the same window. 2 figures came back. For days, the most charitable remaining version of events had already been impossible to me. Now, it became impossible outside my memory too. Paige had not wandered into Skyland. She had not changed direction during her walk. She had not somehow discovered an abandoned park by accident after fighting with me. Walter and Diane took her. The footage had one job. It answered transport. Evidence did not need to be dramatic to be powerful. Sometimes 2 silhouettes returning where 3 had left said enough. The timing also explained Rook without turning him into something impossible. He had followed Paige's fresh route from my parents' property, keeping along the brush beside the service lane, while Walter's utility cart carried the 3 of them towards Skyland. The storm-damaged fence later gave him a way inside that Paige could not have used on her own. Walter's connection to Skyland became similarly ordinary once checked. No secret ownership. No hidden conspiracy. No mysterious control over the abandoned property. He had simply worked there. Years earlier, during Skyland's final period of operation, Walter had been part of the maintenance staff and later supervised maintenance work. Former employment records and people who remembered him established what my childhood memories already suggested. He knew the service geography because he had spent years moving through the hidden side of the park. Employee entrances, maintenance roads, utility access, routes visitors never saw. The fact did not create a new story. It stabilized the one we already had. His slip during the rescue, telling responders not to waste time at the East Employee Gate and directing them behind the carousel, had not been luck. He knew the place. That same knowledge had made Skyland attractive to him as a controlled punishment. He believed he knew where Paige would be. He believed he understood the risks. He believed the park belonged enough to his memory that he could predict how an 11-year-old would behave inside it. That was Walter's fatal mistake. He confused familiarity with control. I thought of him setting the 45-minute timer. He knew the roads. He knew the gate. He knew the haunted house existed. So he believed he knew what would happen next. He had spent his life trusting systems more than people. A locked gate meant a child stayed where you put her. A timer meant fear ended when you decided. A rule meant obedience. What he could not control was rotten wood, or panic, or Rook, or the fact that eventually a lie becomes too complicated for even the person who invented it to carry. The evidence should have made me feel triumphant. Instead, I felt tired. There is a particular exhaustion that comes from being proven right about something you desperately wanted to be wrong about. That evening, Paige asked me the question I had known was coming. She was sitting in a wheelchair for a short period, because the medical team wanted her upright without putting weight on the injured leg. Rook lay nearby, his paws stretched toward the wheel, as though he believed it might escape without him. Paige had been unusually quiet after lunch. I recognized the pattern now. Thinking, holding, trying to decide whether a question was safe. This time, I did not fill the silence for her. Eventually, she said, "If I tell everything, what happens to Aunt Vanessa?" I answered carefully. I told her I did not know yet. There could be consequences for leaving the scene after the collision, and for other choices Vanessa made afterward. Adults responsible for reviewing those things would decide what came next. Paige stared at her hands. Could she lose her job? Maybe. Could Uncle... She stopped. I knew what she meant. Her marriage, her home, the life Diane had described piece by piece until Paige began imagining herself as the person holding a match beside all of it. Paige swallowed. What if everybody loses things because I told? There it was. The deepest injury my parents had tried to give her. Not fear of Skyland, responsibility for truth. I moved my chair in front of hers. Paige, look at me. She did. You did not make Aunt Vanessa hit that cyclist. Her eyes stayed on mine. You did not make her leave. A tiny shake of her head. You did not make Grandma and Grandpa lie to you. Another shake. You did not make them take you to Skyland. Her mouth tightened. And you do not create someone else's consequences by telling the truth about the choice they made. Paige looked down again. But if I didn't say anything, they might avoid consequences. I let that sit. That is not the same as you causing them. For several seconds, she said nothing. Then she whispered, Grandma said I could ruin her whole life. I felt anger rise so quickly I had to breathe before answering. Diane had planted that sentence in an 11-year-old and left it there like a hook. I told Paige the simplest version I knew. If the truth changes Aunt Vanessa's life, the truth is not what made the choice. Paige's forehead creased. I rephrased. She made the choice. You're just not hiding it. That landed. I saw it. Not full understanding. Not healing completed in one sentence. Just the first separation. Choice over here, truth over there. Two different things. Paige leaned back slowly. Rook lifted his head and looked at her. She reached down as far as she comfortably could and touched the fur between his ears. Then she asked something that nearly broke me with its innocence. Does that mean Grandma and Grandpa ruined their own lives too? I did not answer for them. I told her they had made choices too. The rest belonged to adults. That was enough. Later, after Paige fell asleep, I stood at the hospital window and thought about Vanessa being called responsible my entire childhood. The responsible one. The organized one. The daughter who could be trusted with important things. The irony finally reached me. In our family, Vanessa being the responsible one had apparently meant everyone else was responsible for cleaning up after her. The thought came with a bitter little laugh before I could stop it. One short sound, then it was gone. Because beneath the joke sat the real cost. My parents had spent so many years softening every landing for Vanessa that she had never learned how far other people could fall when she refused to take one herself. The next morning, Vanessa came back. She did not ask to see Paige. That was new. Instead, she asked whether Paige knew about the message. I told her no. Paige did not need to read adult texts about herself. Vanessa nodded. Then she asked what Paige did know. I almost told her it was none of her business. Then I realized one part was. I told Vanessa that Paige was worried about ruining her life. Vanessa's face went blank. I continued. Paige had asked whether Vanessa might lose her job, whether her marriage might suffer, whether consequences that followed the collision would somehow become Paige's responsibility because she spoke. Vanessa lowered herself into one of the hallway chairs. She did not cry immediately. That would have been easier to watch. She simply sat. Her hands rested between her knees. For a long time, she said nothing. I could see the moment self-protection stopped working. Not because police had found the text, not because a camera had captured Walter's cart, not because our father's Skyland employment had been verified. Those facts threatened Vanessa. Paige's guilt confronted her. There is a difference. Vanessa had spent days thinking about what she could lose. Her job, her marriage, her standing in the community, maybe freedom, depending on how things unfolded. Now she had to look at what protecting those things had required someone else to carry. A child thought she was responsible for an adult's life. Vanessa covered her mouth. She thinks this is her fault? Part of her does. I did not soften it. Vanessa leaned forward. For the first time since the collision entered our lives, she did not say that she had panicked. She did not say she had planned to tell me. She did not say she never asked our parents to use Skyland. She just sat there with the consequence. When she finally looked up, her face had changed. Not redeemed, not forgiven, simply cornered by a truth she could no longer hand to someone else. I did that to her. I said nothing. Vanessa shook her head. No, Mom and Dad did what they did. I know that. But I made her think telling was the dangerous thing. It was the closest my sister had come to naming her own part without shrinking it. I did not congratulate her. Adults do not deserve prizes for arriving late at responsibility. But I listened. She told me she had spent the previous night rereading the messages she sent our mother. The first one. The second one. Every word she had chosen because she wanted one more night before her life changed. She said she kept seeing Paige trapped under that floor while worrying that Vanessa might lose her job. Then she looked toward Paige's room. I can't let her carry that. My heart tightened. I knew better than to confuse a sentence with a transformation. Vanessa had lived 40 years in a family where someone usually arrived before consequences reached her. One decision would not erase that, but one decision could still matter. She stood. Her hands were shaking. I'm going to correct what I said about the accident. I held her eyes. This was not the confession itself. Not yet. I did not know exactly how she would phrase it, or what legal consequences might follow. Neither did she. Vanessa swallowed. If it costs me my job, my marriage, all of it, then it costs me. For the first time since Paige saw her SUV at that intersection, my sister was preparing to step into the consequences. Our parents had nearly sacrificed my daughter to keep away from her. Vanessa did what she said she was going to do. She corrected the story. I was not in the room when she gave the formal account, and I did not pretend later that I knew every question she was asked or every expression on her face. What I knew came from Vanessa herself afterward, and from the investigator confirming the part that mattered to Paige's case. Vanessa admitted she had been driving the SUV. She admitted she struck the cyclist. She admitted she stopped long enough to understand that a person had been hurt. Then she panicked, got back into the vehicle, and left before doing what any responsible driver should have done. She also corrected the false impression she had allowed our family to carry afterward that she had merely been near the scene or had come upon the aftermath. What mattered was a 40-year-old woman finally saying, in the appropriate place, that the 11-year-old child had seen exactly what she said she saw. For Paige, that mattered more than any punishment could have at that moment. The original secret no longer needed protecting. What struck me was how little the world changed when Vanessa told the truth. The hospital elevators still opened. A nurse still complained gently that Paige had barely touched her breakfast. Someone rolled clean linens past our door. Diane had behaved as if Vanessa's life would collapse the instant the truth became official, yet the truth arrived without thunder. It did not destroy the world. It simply removed the excuse everyone had been using to hurt Paige. Walter did not see it that way. I learned that when he called Vanessa after hearing she had corrected her account. I did not hear the call itself. Vanessa told me about it later, and I saw enough of the aftermath to believe she did not exaggerate. Walter was furious. Not frightened for her. Furious with her. He accused Vanessa of throwing everything away after the family had already sacrificed so much trying to protect her. That word reached me through Vanessa. Sacrificed. My father apparently believed what happened to Paige belonged in the column of things the family had done for Vanessa, not something they had done to Paige. Vanessa sat in a chair across from me in the hospital family room when she repeated it. She looked almost embarrassed by the sentence. He said none of this had to happen if I'd just let them handle it. I watched her for a moment. The old Vanessa would have heard concern inside Walter's anger. She would have translated it as love. Dad is upset because he wants to protect me. That afternoon, she seemed to hear something else. Hierarchy. Walter had spent his life saying family came first, but what he really meant was that certain people in the family came first, and everyone else was expected to absorb whatever made that arrangement possible. Vanessa had always been near the top. She was only beginning to understand the view from there. I asked what Walter thought she should do now. Vanessa rubbed both palms over her face. He wants me to talk to a lawyer before I say anything else. That, by itself, was not unreasonable. Anyone facing serious consequences should understand their rights. But Walter had apparently gone farther. He wanted Vanessa to minimize, clarify, emphasize panic, question whether Paige could really have seen every part of the collision from where she stood. Not deny everything anymore, just soften the edges. It was the same machine operating at a lower speed. When a lie became impossible, Walter did not abandon the mission. He adjusted the defense. That was when I finally understood why he had been so angry that Vanessa corrected the account voluntarily. Her confession did more than expose her. It took control away from him. Walter could protect someone only while that person agreed to stand behind him. Vanessa had stepped out. My mother chose a different strategy. Diane did not call anyone irresponsible. She cried. For most of my life, my mother's tears had frightened me more than my father's anger. Walter's anger pushed. Diane's grief pulled. There is a difference. She asked to speak with me later that day, and I agreed only because Paige was resting and because I wanted to hear whether anything had changed. Diane looked exhausted. That was real. I did not doubt for a second that she had slept badly, or that the sight of her granddaughter being taken out of Skyland had carved something painful into her. People can cause suffering and still suffer themselves. The mistake is believing their pain cancels yours. My mother told me she knew they had made a terrible decision. Then she said everyone had suffered enough. The sentence sounded gentle. It was not. She talked about Walter barely eating, Vanessa's marriage being under strain, the attention surrounding the accident, lawyers, investigators, Paige's injuries, my own exhaustion. She placed all of us into one shared pool of pain. Then came the conclusion. It was time to stop punishing the family. There it was, the same turn. My safety boundary became punishment. My refusal to let Walter and Diane into Paige's room became cruelty. Their consequences became something I was actively doing to them, rather than something flowing from choices they had already made. I listened until she finished. Then I asked my mother what exactly I had done that she considered punishment. She hesitated, not allowing them to see Paige, removing their school access, ending unsupervised contact, refusing to sit down together and work things out. As a family, every example she gave was a form of access she had once enjoyed. None was something she was entitled to. You keep describing losing privileges as if I'm hurting you. Diane looked wounded. We love her. I believed that too. That was what made the story harder. Walter and Diane loved Paige. They had not spent 11 years secretly hating her. My mother had held Paige's hair when she was sick. My father had taught her to ride a bicycle. They remembered birthdays, school projects, favorite foods. And then, when love for Paige came into direct conflict with protecting Vanessa, they chose Vanessa. Love had existed. It simply had not been enough to govern their behavior. Before I could answer, Vanessa appeared at the far end of the corridor. She had come back because she needed to provide one more piece of information connected to the corrected accident account. Diane saw her and immediately shifted. My mother stood. For a second, I thought she might embrace Vanessa. Instead, she began telling my sister, in that careful maternal voice, that she had done enough for one day. She was upset. She was not thinking clearly. Everyone needed time before more irreversible decisions were made. Vanessa stopped several feet away. I stayed silent. This was not my argument to conduct for her. Diane kept talking. She said Paige had been traumatized and confused, that children could connect things after frightening events in ways adults had to interpret carefully. She was no longer denying they took Paige to Skyland. There was too much evidence for that. Instead, she began shifting the motive. Maybe Paige had misunderstood why. Maybe Diane had only been trying to calm her down. Maybe Paige had interpreted concern about Vanessa as pressure to stay silent. The factual ground moved under my mother's feet, and she kept rebuilding the same house on top of it. I felt my hands go cold. Paige had spent days wondering if her eyes had betrayed her. Now Diane was preparing to do the same thing with her memory. I opened my mouth. Vanessa spoke first. Her face was pale, but her voice was steady. "Stop. Paige is telling the truth." My mother froze. The sentence was not loud. It did not need to be. Diane stared at her favored daughter as though she had switched languages. Vanessa continued only far enough to make the point impossible to misunderstand. Paige had seen the collision correctly. Vanessa had wanted her silent for one night. Walter and Diane had taken that request farther. Paige had not imagined the pressure. She had not misunderstood the reason everyone was suddenly talking about loyalty and consequences. Then Vanessa did something I had almost never seen her do with our parents. She refused the rescue. Diane began to say that Vanessa was under enormous stress and should not blame herself for everything. Vanessa shook her head. "No, don't protect me from this." My mother's mouth closed. There was no applause, no sudden transformation. Walter was not there to hear it. Diane did not collapse into remorse. But something fundamental broke. For the first time, the person my parents had spent decades protecting had told them their protection was no longer welcome. The family lie had lost its center. Vanessa looked at me once before leaving. She did not ask whether I forgave her. She did not ask when she could see Paige. That mattered. Accountability that immediately demands a reward is only another transaction. Vanessa seemed to understand, at least for that day, that telling the truth bought her nothing except the right to stop making the damage worse. After Diane left, I sat alone for several minutes. I should have felt satisfaction. Instead, I felt grief. My parents had taught Vanessa that love meant preventing consequences. They taught me that love meant carrying consequences quietly. And somehow, Paige, the youngest person in the family, had been the first one brave enough to expose how broken both definitions were. When I went back into her room, she was awake. She asked if something had happened because she could read my face. This time I gave her an answer appropriate for 11 years old. I told her Aunt Vanessa had admitted she was driving the car. Paige stared at me. I told her Vanessa had also made it clear that Paige had told the truth about what she saw. For a few seconds, Paige did not react. Then she asked the question I should have expected. "Grandma believes her?" I understood what she was really asking. Did everyone finally stop blaming me? I sat on the edge of the chair beside her. I told her Grandma might have complicated feelings, but that did not change what was true. More importantly, Vanessa herself had told Grandma to stop questioning Paige's account. Paige's eyebrows lifted. "Aunt Vanessa said that?" "Yes." She looked toward Rook. He was sleeping near the wall, one ear twitching in whatever dream retired search dogs had after too much hospital time. Paige rubbed the edge of her blanket. "I thought they'd all be mad at me. They might be angry about a lot of things." She looked back at me. That isn't the same as you being wrong. The distinction settled into her slowly. I could see it working. Paige had believed truth caused destruction. Now she was watching something else happen. Truth was creating conflict, yes. But the conflict did not erase the truth. Vanessa and Walter could disagree. Diane could cry. People could lose things. The world could become uncomfortable. And Paige could still be right about what she saw. That was a new experience for her. Maybe for me too. Later, when Paige slept again, I watched the short video from beneath the haunted house floor one final time. I had avoided it since the first viewing. I did not need to hurt myself repeatedly to prove I loved my daughter. But something about Vanessa saying, "Paige is telling the truth," made me need to hear Paige's voice once more. The screen remained almost black, a frightened face lit by a cracked phone. "Mom, I didn't run to the park. Grandma and Grandpa brought me. Rook's here. I'm sorry we fought." The facts in the video had not changed. Its meaning had. The first time I watched it, I heard evidence. Paige had not run away. Walter and Diane brought her. Now I heard something else. She was beneath a broken floor. Her leg hurt. She did not know whether anyone would find her. And she was still trying to protect the relationship between us. I'm sorry we fought. My parents had used that argument as a weapon because they believed anger weakened love. Paige, trapped in the dark, had been trying to repair love because she feared the same thing. I closed the video. I never needed to watch it again. Whatever formal evidentiary value the recording had would be handled by people whose job it was to preserve such things. For me, its job was finished. My daughter had been apologizing for the wrong thing. The adults were finally beginning to take responsibility for the right ones. By then, the investigation no longer depended on any single dramatic clue. Diane's phone contradicted her claim that Paige had never been with them. Paige's account explained the lure, locked gate, planned return, and pressure to stay quiet. Walter's watch checking and later admission established the 45-minute plan. The service road footage corroborated transport toward Skyland and a return without Paige. His maintenance history explained his precise knowledge of the access routes. Vanessa's messages proved she wanted Paige silent that night, but had not ordered the park plan, and her corrected accident account finally validated the observation that started everything. Together, those pieces formed a timeline that did not depend on my anger or Paige's fear being persuasive enough. Investigators completed the next stages of evidence preservation and referred the relevant material for prosecutorial review. Walter and Diane obtained legal counsel, as did Vanessa regarding the collision and her own conduct. The formal process would take time. My part was simpler. Make sure the choices that put Paige behind that gate could not be repeated. Paige was discharged soon afterward with detailed instructions, follow-up appointments, a brace plan, restrictions on weight-bearing, and the kind of medication schedule that made me set 3 separate alarms because exhaustion had reduced my memory to something I no longer trusted. Taking her home felt more emotional than I expected. The house looked exactly as we had left it. Her science worksheet was still on the corner of the kitchen table. I stood looking at it for a long time. 6 unanswered questions. The object that had started our last ordinary argument. I picked it up and put it inside a drawer. Not thrown away. Not framed as some sacred symbol. Just removed from the table. We had larger lessons now. Paige moved carefully through the house with assistance, and Rook followed close enough that I had to remind him her crutches needed space. He accepted the correction for almost 30 seconds, then moved back into position. Paige looked at him. "You know you're not actually my bodyguard." Rook stared at her. She looked at me. He disagrees. For the first time since Skyland, the laugh that came out of me sounded almost normal. It did not last long, but it belonged to us. That evening, after Paige had settled on the couch with her leg elevated and Rook occupying more floor than seemed physically necessary, my phone rang. "Diane." I let it ring twice before answering. I did not put the call on speaker. Paige did not need to hear it. My mother did not ask me to forgive her. Not directly. She asked for one supervised visit. 10 minutes, she said. With me present. Anywhere I chose. Diane said Paige needed to know that her grandparents still loved her. She emphasized that they would respect rules. They would not discuss the case. They would not pressure her. They only wanted Paige to see them and understand she had not been abandoned emotionally because of one terrible decision. The wording was careful, probably rehearsed, and underneath it sat the same assumption that had governed our family for years. We love her. Therefore, we should have access. Love as evidence. Love as entitlement. Love as a credential that remained valid, no matter what someone had done while claiming to possess it. For a moment, the daughter in me wanted to answer. Diane sounded tired. Sorry. Small. I remembered her sitting beside Paige when she had the flu. I remembered Walter teaching her bicycle repair. I remembered the grandparents I believed they had become. Then I looked across my living room. Paige was asleep with one hand resting in Rook's fur. Her crutches leaned against the couch. She had come home from an abandoned amusement park asking whether I was still angry with her. The question in front of me was not whether Diane loved Paige. I believed she did. It was not whether my parents were suffering. They were. It was not even whether they deserved another chance someday. I had no answer for someday. I realized I had spent most of my life making decisions by asking what would keep my parents from hurting. This decision belonged to someone else. I did not give Diane an answer. I told her I had heard the request and ended the call. Then I sat in the quiet living room and watched my daughter sleep. For the first time, I understood exactly what I had to decide next. Not what my parents deserved, not what Vanessa wanted, not what would make the family look whole again. What Paige needed in order to feel safe. The answer to Diane's request did not come from how sorry she sounded on the phone. It did not come from Walter's lawyer, Vanessa's confession, the investigator's timeline, or anything a prosecutor might eventually decide. It came from watching Paige sleep on our couch. For several days after she came home, I noticed how carefully she measured distance. Not constantly. Trauma was not as tidy as that. Sometimes she was almost herself. She complained about the brace rubbing the back of her knee. She negotiated shamelessly over how many episodes of a show counted as resting. She discovered that asking me to bring snacks became much more effective when she pointed dramatically at her injured leg. Other moments were smaller. If I walked into the laundry room without saying where I was going, she called for me. If I took the trash outside after dark, her eyes followed me through the window until I came back. If the doorbell rang unexpectedly, her shoulders lifted before she could stop them. And every time someone said the words Grandma or Grandpa, something moved behind her face. Not rage, not even simple fear, calculation. Was someone coming? Would she have to see them? Would she be expected to say something? Would an adult once again decide that family meant she should endure what made everyone else more comfortable? That was the part Diane could not hear when she asked for 10 supervised minutes. To her, the request was small. 10 minutes. Me present. A public place if I wanted. No talk about the case. No pressure. But safety was not measured in minutes. I had spent my life deciding whether somebody deserved another chance. That morning, I finally understood I was asking the wrong question. The right question was simpler. Did Paige feel safe? I waited until after breakfast, after medication, after we had handled the slow, awkward process of getting her settled into the armchair near the window, with her legs supported. Rook lay across the threshold between the living room and hallway, not blocking anyone, just present. I sat beside Paige. I did not tell her Grandma was crying. I did not tell her Walter was miserable. I did not explain that they wanted only one visit, or that they promised to behave. All of those details would have turned my question into pressure. I told Paige only what she needed. Grandma and Grandpa had asked whether they could see her with me present. I made it clear she was not being asked to decide what happened to them legally or whether they would ever be part of our lives again. Then I asked one thing. Do you feel safe seeing them right now? Paige looked down at her hands. The silence lasted long enough that I worried even the question was too much. Then she shook her head. No. Her voice was almost apologetic. That single syllable was enough. I did not ask why. I did not ask whether maybe she could tolerate 5 minutes. I did not remind her of birthdays or bicycle rides or the nights Diane sat beside her when she was sick. No, did not need a closing argument. I touched her hand. Okay. Paige looked at me. That's it? That's it. Something in her shoulders lowered. Not dramatically, maybe half an inch. But I saw it. For days, adults had asked Paige to reconsider what she saw, reconsider what she remembered, reconsider how much damage the truth might cause, reconsider whether other people's futures mattered more than her certainty. This time she gave an answer, and the adult beside her accepted it. No negotiation. That tiny experience felt as important as anything I had done since bringing her home. Protective consent, not responsibility. Paige was allowed to know whether she felt safe. She was not responsible for writing the permanent sentence of our family. That part belonged to me. I called Diane later that morning. I told her there would be no visit. She went quiet. Then she asked whether I had even discussed it with Paige. I said yes. That seemed to hurt more than if I had simply refused on my own. My mother had probably imagined that if Paige had a voice in the decision, love would pull her back. Children forgave. Children missed people. Children could be reminded of good memories. Diane still did not understand that Paige could love them and still be afraid of them. The two conditions could exist together. My mother asked whether Walter and she could speak with me in person. I agreed. Not at my house. Not with Paige present. And not because the answer might change. I wanted the final boundary delivered face to face, because there were things my parents had spent years interpreting as temporary whenever I said them gently. This could not be one of them. We met the following afternoon in a quiet room attached to the office of the attorney I had consulted regarding Paige's safety and practical family boundaries. It was not a courtroom. No judge waited behind a bench. No spectators. No relatives packed into chairs to witness somebody's humiliation. Just 3 people who had once been a family in one shape and could no longer continue in it. Walter looked smaller than he had at Skyland. Not physically smaller, less certain. For most of my life, my father entered rooms as if he already understood their rules. Now, attorneys, investigators, evidence, and his own admissions had placed him inside systems he could not control by speaking firmly. Diane sat beside him. She had aged in the weeks since Paige disappeared. I noticed and hated myself a little for noticing. Children are not supposed to enjoy watching their parents become old, even when those parents have done something unforgivable. That was another truth revenge stories rarely make room for. I could be furious with them, and still recognize my mother's hands. Still remember those fingers braiding my hair when I was 6. Still know exactly how Walter smelled after working in the garage. Consequences did not erase history. They only stopped history from being used as permission. I told them there would be no supervised visit. Not now. Diane immediately said they understood Paige was upset, but this distance could make the trauma worse. If Paige began believing her grandparents had disappeared forever, she might feel abandoned all over again. I almost admired the speed with which my mother could turn access into therapy. I told her Paige had been asked whether she felt safe seeing them. She did not. Walter's jaw tightened. He said children should not be put in charge of adult relationships. I agree. That answer interrupted whatever argument he expected. I told him Paige had not been asked whether they deserved prison, forgiveness, permanent estrangement, or anything else. An 11-year-old should never have to decide. She had been asked whether she felt safe. Her answer governed access for now. That was parenting. not punishment. Diane's eyes filled. We are still her grandparents. The sentence had become a key she kept trying, in a lock that had changed. I looked at both of them. That was a privilege. You used it to get her through that gate. Neither spoke. I had not rehearsed the line. Maybe that was why it landed so cleanly. They had been able to take Paige to Skyland because she trusted the word grandparents. Because Grandma and Grandpa could say Mom was looking for you, and an 11-year-old would believe them. Because they had years of school pickups, cocoa, sleepovers, scrape-knee comfort, and ordinary love behind them. They had not broken into my house and kidnapped a stranger. They used the authority I had given them. The authority Paige had given them. That was why blood could not restore it automatically. Walter leaned back. Then he returned to his last defense. The floor was never supposed to collapse. They never intended Paige to be injured. He repeated that they were coming back. 45 minutes. He said it as though the number still contained mercy. This time I did not argue with the accident. I agreed. That surprised him. Yes, the floor collapse was an accident. Walter nodded once, too quickly. Then I continued. The lie about me being inside Skyland was not an accident. The ride there was not an accident. The service gate was not an accident. The chain was not an accident. The padlock was not an accident. The 45-minute timer was not an accident. Leaving an 11-year-old alone inside restricted property so fear would change. Her mind was not an accident. And when I arrived asking where my daughter was, telling me she had never come to their house was not an accident either. The collapse was the one part they had not planned. Everything that placed Paige above that rotten floor had been planned. Walter looked at the table. For days, we were coming back. Had functioned like a rope he could hold while the rest of the story collapsed around him. I watched him finally understand that the rope was attached to nothing. Planning to stop an act did not erase planning the act. Diane tried another direction. She said they had believed they were protecting the family, that Paige's life should never have been endangered, but everything began because Vanessa was terrified, and they were trying to prevent one mistake from destroying people who loved each other. There it was again. Loyalty. I asked my mother one question. What loyalty did Paige get? Diane blinked. I told her everyone had spoken about loyalty when it meant protecting Vanessa. Vanessa deserved loyalty after hitting someone. Vanessa deserved loyalty after leaving. Vanessa deserved loyalty while she postponed telling the truth. Walter and Diane deserved loyalty when their plan was discovered. But Paige, the 11-year-old who told the truth? What did family loyalty mean when she was the person in danger? Who stayed for her? My mother opened her mouth. Nothing persuasive came. I did not need an answer. The answer already existed. Walter and Diane left. Rook stayed. The humans who kept saying family loyalty had treated it like a debt owed upward. The animal who could not say the phrase had understood its simplest form. Someone vulnerable was alone, so he did not leave. Diane looked down. Her silence did more than a confession would have. I had no interest in forcing her to produce the exact words that would make an audience feel satisfied. Real people rarely offer perfect endings. Sometimes accountability begins when an excuse no longer works and nothing better replaces it. I told my parents the restrictions remained. No school or emergency access, no unsupervised time, no direct contact with Paige unless I approved it, and no appearing at our house or school. Whatever happened in formal proceedings would happen separately. Our boundary did not depend on a conviction. It depended on what I knew as Paige's parent and what she needed to feel safe. Walter called that unfair. The word almost made me smile, because it had spent my entire childhood facing in the wrong direction. I did not argue. I stood. As I reached the door, Diane asked whether I hated them. That was the first question either of my parents had asked that I could not answer quickly. Hatred would have been cleaner than what I actually felt: grief, mixed with anger, memory, disbelief, and something like mourning for people who were still alive. I don't know what I feel yet, I said. but I know what Paige needs. The consequences spread quietly after that. The school and after-school programs operated under the new permissions already in place. People who had once accepted Walter and Diane's judgment without question began checking twice. Some struggled to reconcile the grandparents they knew with what had happened at Skyland, but the central distinction no longer moved. The floor collapse was accidental. Putting Paige behind the locked gate was not. Walter and Diane lost the authority they had always assumed came with being family elders. Trust did not explode. It evaporated. Walter could no longer use certainty as proof he was right, and Diane could no longer treat connection as a guarantee that everyone would keep returning. Vanessa accepted a different kind of distance. Several days after my meeting with our parents, she brought me a sealed letter for Paige and made the boundary clear herself. I could read it, keep it, throw it away, or give it to Paige someday, if Paige wanted it. She would not ask whether it had been read, send another, or use the apology to request a visit. I opened it after Paige went to sleep. Vanessa had crossed out part of a paragraph where she tried too hard to explain her panic. What remained was simpler. She told Paige she had seen correctly, that she should have been able to trust adults with the truth, and that Vanessa's request to be protected from consequences had placed a burden on Paige that never belonged to her. She apologized without asking for forgiveness. I folded the letter and put it away. Paige was still learning how to sleep through the night. She did not need to become the judge of whether Vanessa had shown enough remorse. The letter could wait, and Vanessa accepted that. Formal consequences continued in the background. Vanessa had legal and professional matters connected to the collision. Walter and Diane had their own counsel as prosecutors reviewed the evidence related to Paige. There were no instant convictions, no sentence delivered before the paperwork was complete. I did not spend my days imagining prison terms. I found that I cared less about punishment than I once thought I would. The one outcome I needed most had already begun. They could not do it again. That was justice in the part of the world I controlled. Paige returned home fully before she returned to herself. Physically, her recovery progressed the way doctors expected. Swelling decreased. The bruising changed from deep purple to ugly yellow-green, and then gradually faded. She learned to use crutches without looking like she was negotiating with two hostile pieces of aluminum. Rook considered the crutches an unacceptable redesign of his walking space. For the first few days, I had to remind him repeatedly not to position himself exactly where Paige needed to place the next crutch. Paige told him that saving her life did not exempt him from basic hallway etiquette. Rook stared back without remorse. Those moments mattered. We needed ordinary irritation. We needed things that were annoying, but not dangerous. We needed to remember that a family was allowed to have problems smaller than survival. Still, the deeper wound surfaced in unexpected ways. Paige started asking permission for things she had never asked permission for before. Could she go to her room? Could she close the door? Could she sit on the porch? If I said yes, she sometimes added where exactly she would be, as though she needed to provide coordinates, so I would not think she had vanished. I kept my reactions small. No speeches. No telling her she was safe, over and over, until the words became meaningless. Instead, I practiced reliability. If I said dinner was in 20 minutes, I checked on her in 20. If I went to the store, I told her where I was going, and when I expected to return. If plans changed, I sent a message. Not forever. Not because an 11-year-old needed to track her mother. Because after abandonment, predictability was medicine. One night, about a week after my meeting with Walter and Diane, Paige and I had our first real disagreement since coming home. Nothing dramatic. She had been told not to put weight on the injured leg without following the progression her medical team gave us. I found her attempting to stand from the couch without her crutches because she wanted to prove she could make it to the kitchen. Fear made my voice sharper than I intended. Paige's face closed immediately, the old expression, the one from the night she left. For a second, both of us froze. Then I lowered my voice. I explained that I was not angry at her for wanting independence. I was scared she would set back the healing. She told me she was tired of everybody treating her like she might break. Fair. I told her Bones did not care whether being careful was annoying. Also fair. The conversation ended without either of us winning. Paige leaned back against the couch, irritated with me. I carried the glass of water she had been trying to get and put it on the table without saying I told you so. For several minutes we sat in separate silences. The house remained tense and safe. That mattered. An hour later, I helped her get ready for bed. Rook followed. The routine had started feeling normal again. Brush teeth. Brace checked. Pillows arranged. Dog occupying an unreasonable percentage of the floor. I turned off the larger lamp and left the small one near her bed glowing. I was almost at the door when Paige said my name. I turned. She was looking at the blanket. What? Her fingers moved along the edge of it. I know Grandma and Grandpa can't take me anywhere. I waited. And Aunt Vanessa can't just make everything go away anymore. Yes. Another pause. Then she looked at me. Her face was serious in the way only children can be when they are asking something enormous, using very few words. If I get mad at you again someday? She stopped. I walked back toward the bed. Paige swallowed. If I get mad at you again someday, do I still get to come home? For 1 second, I could not breathe. We had changed school permissions, closed doors to Walter and Diane, stopped the family lie, put legal consequences into motion, protected Paige from being forced into reconciliation. I had done everything I knew how to do to make sure no one could lock my daughter behind another gate. And still, somewhere inside her, one remained. A locked gate between anger and belonging. Paige was no longer asking whether Walter and Diane would be punished. She was asking something much more important, whether love could survive her being difficult, whether home was permanent, whether one bad argument could ever make me decide she no longer deserved to return. I sat beside her and took her hand. And I realized protecting Paige from my parents had only stopped the danger. Now I had to help her rebuild the thing they had damaged most. The belief that home was not something she could lose by being angry. I did not make Paige wait for the answer. She was still looking at me from beneath the small bedside lamp, one hand tucked under the blanket, the other resting inside mine. If I get mad at you again someday, do I still get to come home? Yes. The word came before everything else. No pause, no qualification, no lecture about respecting rules first. No reminder that leaving without telling me had been dangerous. Yes. Every time. Paige watched my face as though she expected an exception to appear if she waited long enough. I moved closer. I told her home was not something she earned by being pleasant. It was not a prize for finishing homework, telling the truth perfectly, keeping her room clean, or agreeing with me. We could be furious with each other. I could take her phone away again someday. She could think I was unfair. She could slam a bedroom door, cry, need space, disappoint me, or make a bad decision. There would still be consequences when consequences were appropriate. None of them would be exile. You never have to earn the right to come back through our door. Paige's eyes filled. She turned her face toward the pillow for a moment. I did not rush to wipe the tears away. Sometimes, comforting someone means letting the feeling finish. After a while, she asked, "Even if I say something mean? Even then? What if I lie again? We deal with the lie. And I still live here?" I almost smiled. "Yes, Paige, you still live here." Her fingers tightened around mine. The questions sounded simple enough that another person might have found them almost funny. I did not. Walter and Diane had taken one ordinary mother-daughter argument and attached a terrifying meaning to it. You made Mom angry. Mom went looking for you. You created this problem. Now do what we say, if you want it fixed. That night at Skyland had not only taught Paige that adults could abandon her, it had taught her that anger might cancel belonging. That was the belief I had to undo, not with one beautiful speech, with repetition. I could tell her she always had a home. Then I had to behave, as if that were true the next time she was difficult, and the time after that, and the 100th time after that. Love was not proven in the moment when everyone agreed. It was proven by what remained when they did not. We talked a little longer that night. Not about Walter. Not about court proceedings or prosecutors or Vanessa's job. About us. I told Paige we needed a new way to handle the moments when one of us needed distance. Her first suggestion was that I simply stop annoying her. I stared at her. She managed a small smile. It was the most 11-year-old answer imaginable, and I was so grateful for it that I nearly laughed. Instead, we made actual rules. If she needed space after an argument, she could go to her room and close the door. She could sit on the porch. When her leg healed, she could take a short walk along an agreed route, if she told me first where she was going and how long she expected to be gone. If she was too angry to talk, she could text me. Even a simple message. I'm safe. I need 10 minutes. I promised not to chase her into an argument just because she needed space. She promised not to disappear in order to create it. The goal was not perfect obedience. I did not want a daughter who stayed beside me because she was afraid to leave. I wanted a daughter who knew how to leave a tense room without leaving safety. That distinction became one of the most important lessons Skyland gave us. Not every form of leaving was abandonment. Not every form of staying was love. Walter and Diane had stayed in our lives for years while quietly asking me to carry things that belonged to Vanessa. Rook had physically left Paige beneath the haunted house floor and saved her by doing it. The meaning lived in the reason. Healing, I learned, happened through details like that. Not grand breakthroughs, tiny corrections. We wrote the new rules on an index card and put it on the refrigerator. Paige thought that was embarrassingly official. I told her the alternative was a laminated binder. She accepted the index card. That was our first successful negotiation under the new system. The following weeks were quieter than the ones before them. Not easy. Quieter. Paige's fracture healed on the timetable the doctors expected rather than the timetable she preferred. At first, progress meant less swelling, then better movement, then a change in how much weight she was allowed to place through the injured leg. There were follow-up appointments and repeat imaging. Exercises she found boring. Instructions she thought were overly cautious, until I reminded her that bones were unimpressed by impatience. The bruises disappeared long before the fear did. By late November, the crutches were gone. By early December, roughly 2 months after Skyland, Paige had completed the main phase of recovery from the non-displaced fracture and was easing back into ordinary activity. Easing. Not sprinting. Not suddenly playing sports as though nothing had happened. Her gait was almost normal, but fatigue still showed after a long day. She had exercises to rebuild strength and instructions to increase activity gradually. Rook approved of the slower pace. He was 8 years old, after all. He had never objected to a medical plan involving additional naps. His role changed, too. He was not Paige's magical therapist. He did not cure nightmares by lying beside her. He did not somehow sense every difficult thought. Sometimes he slept through things. Sometimes Paige got upset, and Rook remained in the kitchen because someone had opened the refrigerator. He was a dog. A remarkably trained, deeply loved dog. That was enough. One cold afternoon in early December, Paige and I sat together on the couch while rain tapped lightly against the front window. The trees outside were mostly bare by then. Wet leaves had collected in corners of the yard, and darkness came before dinner. Rook was stretched on the rug. Paige had been quieter than usual. I had learned not to ask what was wrong every time silence appeared. Eventually she spoke on her own. She told me she still thought about the moment Rook left her. Not the fall, not the gate. Rook. I turned toward her. She explained that even though she understood what happened now, Part of her still remembered the sound of his nails moving away above the broken floor, the sound getting softer, then disappearing. "I knew I told him to go," she said. "But when I couldn't hear him anymore, I thought maybe I shouldn't have." That was the first time she had described that part so clearly. She remembered giving the command. She remembered knowing intellectually that sending Rook back was probably her best chance. But knowledge did not stop the dark from feeling empty after he left. "I thought maybe he wasn't coming back either." The last word almost disappeared. I understood then that Rook's greatest act of loyalty had also reproduced, for a few terrifying minutes, the exact fear Walter and Diane had created. Someone leaving. I reached over and took her hand. "Rook did leave you." Paige looked surprised. Maybe she expected me to correct the word. I did not. "He left where you were." Then I explained the distinction I had been learning too. Abandonment was not simply somebody moving away from you. People went to work, parents went to the grocery store, friends went home, dogs ran for help. Sometimes love required leaving a place. What mattered was why someone left, and what they did with the distance. Walter and Diane left Paige because her fear was useful to them. They wanted her alone. Rook left because staying beside her could no longer get her out. His leaving had one purpose: to return with help. "He didn't choose somewhere else over you," I said. "He went because of you." Paige looked at Rook. He was asleep on his side with one rear paw twitching slightly. Not exactly the heroic image the story deserved. She watched him for several seconds. "So he left me without abandoning me." "Yes." She thought about that, then nodded once. It was a small correction, but I saw something settle. For weeks, Paige had been organizing people into two categories: the ones who stayed, the ones who left. Now she was beginning to understand that loyalty was more complicated and more useful than geography. Some people stayed close and made you unsafe. Some went away and came back carrying help. Some relationships ended because ending them was how safety was restored. That last truth belonged to me. I missed my parents. It took me longer than I expected to admit that. Anger had made the first weeks easier. Anger wakes you up. It answers questions quickly. Should Walter and Diane have access to Paige? No. Should I restore school permissions? No. Should I make Paige see them because they were sorry? No. Anger was excellent at building a fence. Grief arrived once the fence was standing. It appeared in stupid places. The grocery store. Diane always bought one particular kind of cinnamon cookie around Christmas. I saw a box on a shelf and had to stand still for several seconds before I could move on. Walter had a habit of leaving me voicemails that began in the middle of whatever thought he was having, as if the phone had joined the conversation late. For weeks after I stopped ordinary contact, I would see an old voicemail in my phone and feel an ache so sharp it surprised me. I missed people who had hurt my daughter. There was no moral victory in pretending otherwise. More accurately, I missed the parents I believed they had become. The grandparents who kept Paige's cereal. The man who repaired her bike. The woman who sat beside her during the flu. Those memories remained true. So did Skyland. That was the part I finally learned to hold without trying to make one erase the other. Walter and Diane had loved Paige. They had also endangered her deliberately to protect Vanessa. I did not have to decide that every good memory was fake in order to keep Paige safe from them. And I did not have to reopen our door because some of the memories were real. People talk about forgiveness as though it is the same thing as access. It is not. Perhaps someday I would forgive my parents in the private sense of no longer needing anger to carry them around in my head. Perhaps I would not. I stopped treating that question as urgent. Access was different. Access required trust. Trust required evidence over time. And Paige's safety was not a test laboratory where Walter and Diane could demonstrate whether they had changed. The boundary stayed. That was not vengeance. It was the absence of denial. Vanessa's legal and professional consequences continued at their proper pace, but I stopped following every development. Her trouble had occupied the center of our family for most of her life, and I was finished recreating that pattern. The apology letter remained in my desk. Paige knew it existed and said she did not want to read it yet, so the envelope stayed closed. Vanessa did not ask again or send anyone to lobby for her. Correcting the truth had stopped the damage from growing. It had not restored a relationship on demand. And then, one evening in December, Paige and I argued again. I knew we would, eventually. The subject was almost insultingly ordinary. Her room, specifically, the collection of clothes, notebooks, shoes, chargers, and objects I could not identify, that had migrated across the floor over several days. I asked her to clean it before using her tablet. Paige informed me that she knew where everything was. I pointed at a sock hanging from her desk lamp and asked how that fact improved the situation. She said I did not understand her organizational system. I said gravity did not qualify as an organizational system. Her expression darkened. Mine probably did too. The conversation gained exactly enough heat for both of us to recognize the old shape. Not Skyland, not danger, just irritation. A mother enforcing something. An 11-year-old believing civilization could survive one more night without a clean floor. Paige folded her arms. I told her the tablet stayed downstairs until the room was handled. She made a sound under her breath. I asked what she said. She told me it was safer if I did not know. That was probably true. Then she turned toward the coat hooks. My entire body noticed. The movement was so familiar that for one instant October returned. Purple sweatshirt, front door, Rook at the window, the silence afterward. My heart accelerated before my mind could remind it what month we were in. Paige reached for her jacket. Rook stood immediately. Not slowly. Not with the reluctance of an aging dog getting up after dinner. Instantly. Ready. He looked from Paige to the door, with the unmistakable posture of someone who had apparently decided retirement did not apply to family disputes. Paige stared at him. "You are such a traitor." Rook's ears lifted. I bit the inside of my cheek. Our new conflict plan, I thought, apparently came with 78 pounds of supervision. Paige put on the jacket. Then she stopped. Her hand remained on the zipper. I said nothing. This was the moment. Not the day Vanessa confessed. Not the meeting with Walter and Diane. Not any future legal outcome. This. The same emotional setup that had once ended with my daughter disappearing into danger. Anger. A jacket. A door. Space. Paige looked at me. I need 10 minutes. I waited. On the porch. My chest tightened. Okay. She opened the door, then turned back. 10. She stepped outside. Rook followed her before either of us could suggest otherwise. The door closed. Not slammed. Closed. I stood in the kitchen. Every frightened part of me wanted to open it immediately. Check. Confirm. Stand in the doorway where I could see every breath. I did not. Healing belonged to both of us. Paige had to learn she could take safe space. I had to learn that allowing safe space did not mean I was losing her, so I stayed inside. Through the window beside the door, I could see only part of the porch. I deliberately moved away from it. The house was quiet. Not the terrible quiet from the night Paige disappeared. A different kind. The furnace clicked on. The refrigerator hummed. Somewhere upstairs, one of the heating vents made a faint metallic tick. Then I heard the porch chair shift beneath Paige. Still there. A second later came the soft scrape of Rook repositioning himself. Still there. I breathed. 10 minutes earlier, we had been irritated with each other. We were still irritated. Nothing about the new system required. Pretending conflict felt pleasant. Paige would still have to clean her room. The tablet would remain downstairs until she did. Love had not erased consequences. Consequences had not erased home. That was the difference. After several minutes, I moved through the living room and could see them more clearly. Paige sat wrapped in her jacket on the porch chair, staring toward the bare maple branches moving in the cold wind. Rook lay on the boards between her chair and the doorway, not trapping her outside, not guarding me from her, simply occupying the space between us. The people who had spoken most loudly about family loyalty had once driven my daughter through a gate and locked it behind her because her fear was cheaper than Vanessa's consequences. Rook had never spoken the word loyalty. He did not know what reputation meant. He did not understand family hierarchy. He knew only the practical version. Stay when staying helps. Leave when leaving brings help. Come back. Do not make the vulnerable one suffer because everyone else would prefer comfort. A few minutes later, the door opened. Paige came inside on her own. Rook followed. She hung her jacket up and looked at me. I'm still annoyed. I assumed so. And I still think my room is organized. That part remains delusional. She rolled her eyes. Then she headed upstairs. Halfway to the stairs, she stopped. She turned back toward me, not frightened, not checking whether I would allow her to remain, just making sure I was listening. I'm going to clean it. I nodded. Rook started after her. Paige pointed at him. You are not supervising this. He continued up the stairs. She looked at me in outrage. I laughed. A real laugh this time. Warm, easy. The sound followed them upstairs. I stayed where I was for a moment and listened to Paige moving around her room above me. A drawer opened. Something fell. She muttered. Rook's tags jingled. Ordinary life. That was the ending I had once been too frightened to imagine. Not a perfect family. Not a restored one. Not everyone forgiven and sitting around the same table because blood demanded a happy photograph. Just my daughter upstairs, still capable of being annoyed with me. My dog following her because apparently that was his retirement plan, and me downstairs, no longer afraid that anger meant someone I loved would disappear. The argument had changed the mood of our home. It had not changed Paige's place inside it. For the first time since that night in October, nobody needed to run after anyone. Nobody needed rescuing. Nobody had to earn their way back. We were already home.